Can you imagine 68 years old, having spent her life building an empire with the man she loved, only to find out one day she'd been divorced months earlier, without even knowing it? And the betrayer is the very man she rescued from nothing. This is the story of Eleanor, the woman erased from her own marriage. Like now, if you want the betrayer to pay the price, comment the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far this story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next shocking stories. The letter didn't look like the end of my life. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moments that destroy you. They don't arrive with sirens or thunder. They come in plain white envelopes with a law firm's logo printed neatly in the corner, sitting in a stack of mail between a water bill and a furniture catalog. I almost set it aside. I almost walked back into the kitchen, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and let that envelope sit unopened on the kitchen counter until evening. I didn't. I remember the exact weight of it in my hand. I remember standing in the foyer of the house I had lived in for 31 years, still wearing my coat because I'd just come in from my father's burial. The smell of cemetery earth was still on my shoes. My eyes were raw from 4 days of crying. My hands, the same hands that had built a technology company from a 2-room office on the edge of bankruptcy, those hands were shaking as I slid open the seal. Whitmore versus Whitmore. Final decree of dissolution. I read it 3 times before the words made sense. I had been divorced for 4 months. Quote, I need to back up, because if I tell this story out of order, you'll miss what made it so vicious. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 68 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades building Whitmore Systems, a mid-sized enterprise software company headquartered in Seattle, Washington. We weren't Google, we weren't Microsoft, but we were good, profitable, stable, and for a long time, something I was genuinely proud of. I wrote the first business plan on a yellow legal pad at our kitchen table in 1989. I cold called the first investors myself. I negotiated the first contracts. I stayed up nights debugging software I barely understood so I could speak intelligently to the engineers I was trying to hire. My husband Damien was brilliant. That part was never a lie. He had a gift for systems engineering that I recognized before anyone else did, and I recruited him out of a failing startup when I could barely pay my own salary. We built that company side by side for 27 years. And somewhere in those years, we built what I believed was a marriage. We married in 1994. We tried for children. Or I tried, while Damien, in retrospect, grew more absent with each failed attempt. By my mid-40s, the doctors made it final. It wasn't going to happen. I grieved privately, the way I did most things, quietly, without making it anyone else's problem. Damien said the right things. He held my hand at the last appointment. He told me that our life was enough. I believed him. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not his betrayal. My belief. The call to the probate attorney's office was supposed to be about something else entirely. My father, Harold Merritt, passed away in October after a short illness. He was 83, sharp until nearly the end, and deeply private about money in the way men of his generation often were. I had no idea, no real idea, what his estate looked like until his attorney, a quiet, careful man named Gerald Fossey, called me into his downtown office 2 weeks after the funeral. What my father left me was not a modest inheritance. My father had spent 60 years quietly investing in real estate, municipal bonds, and a series of small but remarkably well-managed private holdings. The total estate, after taxes, after legal fees, after the disbursements to various charities he'd named, came to just under $4 million. All of it to me, his only child. I sat across from Gerald Fossey in that leather chair, and I didn't feel rich. I felt the particular grief of realizing how little you truly knew someone. $4 million accumulated over 60 years, and he had never mentioned a word of it. I thought about the Christmas dinners where he'd complained about property taxes. I thought about the used Buick he drove until the transmission gave out. I was still in that grief when Gerald set a second folder on the desk and slid it across to me. Mrs. Whitmore, as he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it. Before we proceed to the transfer documentation, I need to confirm your current legal status. Our records show a discrepancy. I didn't understand. What kind of discrepancy? He opened the folder. I saw the words King County Superior Court on the top of the first page. Our title search flagged this during the estate verification process, Gerald said. According to court records, a dissolution of marriage was finalized in your name on June 14th of this year. Under state law, that affects how certain inherited assets are classified. The room went very quiet. That's not possible, I said. I have the decree here. He turned it around on the desk so I could read it. Eleanor Ann Whitmore, petitioner. Damian James Whitmore, respondent, the petitioner. I was listed as the one who had filed. I didn't file anything, I said. My voice sounded strange to me. Very flat, very controlled. I've been caring for my dying father since August. I haven't spoken to an attorney about anything except his estate. I didn't file for divorce. Gerald Fossey looked at me for a long moment. He was old enough and experienced enough to understand what he was looking at. Mrs. Whitmore, he said quietly, I think you need to speak to a different kind of attorney. I drove home in silence. I don't remember most of that drive. I remember the rain on the windshield and the way the wipers kept their steady rhythm, indifferent to everything. I remember parking in the driveway and sitting there for a long time, the engine off, looking at the house. Our house. 31 years of it. The maple tree Damien had planted the first autumn we moved in was huge now, its branches reaching across half the front yard. The porch light was on. His car was in the garage. He was home. I thought about going inside and confronting him immediately. Part of me, the part that had survived every hard thing in my life by moving toward it rather than away, wanted to walk through that door and put the decree on the kitchen table and watch his face. I didn't. Something stopped me. Not fear. Something colder than fear. A kind of clarity that I hadn't felt in years, cutting through the grief and the shock like a blade through fog. If Damien had done this, if he had actually forged a divorce behind my back while I was burying my father, then anger was the most dangerous thing I could show him right now. Angry people make mistakes. Angry people move too fast. Angry people lose. I needed to know everything before he knew I knew anything. I started my car again and drove to a hotel. Potat. The first thing I did was call my college roommate, Patricia Holt, who had spent 30 years practicing family law in Chicago before retiring to Portland. It was past 9 o'clock. She answered on the second ring. Ellie, she said. She always called me that. I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, because I'm going to tell you something and I need you to be a lawyer right now, not a friend. She was quiet for a beat. All right. I told her everything. The estate meeting, the decree, my name listed as petitioner on a divorce I had never filed. When I finished, there was a long pause. Eleanor, she said, and her voice had shifted into something very precise. What you're describing is identity fraud. Someone forged your signature on a legal filing and impersonated you in a court proceeding. That's not just civil, that's criminal. I know. Do you have any idea who would have access to your identification? Your social security number? Your signature? I thought about it. My husband manages the company's administrative systems. He has access to every document I've ever signed. Another pause. Is there any possibility, and I'm asking this gently, that you did sign something during a difficult period without fully understanding what it was? My father's final weeks came back to me in a wave. The hospital, the hospice, the endless paperwork of a dying man's final arrangements. I had signed dozens of documents in those weeks, most of them in waiting rooms and corridors, handed to me by people I trusted. I signed things, I said slowly. I signed a lot of things. I was barely sleeping. My father was dying. Then that's where we start. Patricia's voice was steady now. Don't go back to the house. Don't confront Damien. Don't transfer $1 of your father's estate into any account he has access to. Can you do that? Yes. Good. Tomorrow morning I'm calling a colleague in Seattle, the best forensic legal specialist I know. You're going to be okay, Ellie, but you need to be very careful. I hung up and sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time. The bedspread was that anonymous, inoffensive pattern hotels always use, and I stared at it without seeing it. 68 years old. I had survived a company that nearly went bankrupt twice. I had survived the grief of never having a child. I had survived my father's slow death and the paperwork avalanche that followed it. I had built something with my own hands that employed 437 people. And someone I had shared a bed with for 31 years, thought that grief would make me easy. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because it matters for everything that came after. I didn't cry. I wasn't trembling. What I felt was very specific and very cold, and if I had to name it, I would call it the quiet fury of a woman who realizes she has been underestimated for the last time. Patricia's colleague was named Margaret Chen, and she had a corner office in a building downtown that communicated, without stating it, that she had won more than she had lost. I sat across from her the next morning with the divorce decree, my father's estate documents, and a list I had spent the night writing in the hotel notepad. Every document I could remember signing in the last 6 months. Every date. Every approximate context. Margaret read through everything without interrupting me. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of focus that made you feel like every word you said was being accurately cataloged. "Tell me about the hospice paperwork," she said, when I finished. "There was a lot of it," I said. "Transfer agreements, care authorizations, insurance verifications. Most of it was handed to me by the hospice coordinator or my father's attending physician." "Anyone else present?" I thought. Damien came twice. The first week my father was admitted, and then again about 10 days before he passed. Margaret looked up. "Did he handle any of the paperwork?" The memory surfaced slowly, the way memories do when you're not sure you want to find them. Damien, in the corridor outside my father's room. A clipboard in his hand. "I'll take care of this one, Eleanor. You go sit with your dad." My stomach dropped. "Yes," I said. "We'll need the hospice's records of every document signed during that period," Margaret said. She was already writing. "Signature comparisons, notarization records. The court filing has to have a notarized signature. Someone physically witnessed a signature and certified it. That person committed a crime. We will find them." "How long will this take?" "Weeks," she said. "Possibly months. And Mrs. Whitmore," she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "I need to know what you want at the end of this. Because this path leads to criminal charges, public exposure, and what will likely be an extremely contentious battle over a company you own half of. I need to know you understand that." I looked at her. "I want the truth," I said. "And then I want everything that is mine." She nodded. "Then we start today." What I did not tell Margaret Chen that morning, what I had not yet told anyone, was the thing I had noticed when I drove past the office building at 7 a.m. before our meeting. Damien's car was in his reserved space. He was already there. And parked 2 spaces down from his, in a visitor spot, was a white Range Rover I had seen before. Not often, not in any context I could immediately place, but once, about 8 months earlier, at a company fundraiser. A vehicle that had driven past, and that Damien had watched with an expression I had not understood at the time. I had not understood it at the time. I understood it now. That car belonged to someone. Someone who had been in Damien's orbit for long enough that her presence at our building on an early Tuesday morning felt unremarkable to anyone who might glance out a window. I pulled out the notepad I'd been writing in all night. I wrote down the license plate number. Then I drove to my meeting with Margaret Chen, and I didn't say a word about the Range Rover, because some pieces of evidence you hold close until you know exactly what to do with them. I had been underestimated my entire professional life. I had been patronized in boardrooms, talked over in meetings, congratulated in that particular hollow way people congratulate women who have accomplished something the congratulator didn't think they were capable of. Damien had watched all of that happen. He knew exactly how I'd been underestimated, and he had made the mistake of doing it himself. I had survived everything else. I was going to survive this too. The license plate came back to a leasing company. That wasn't unusual. A lot of people leased vehicles. But the leasing company was a small outfit based in Bellevue that Margaret's investigator described as the kind of place that doesn't ask too many questions if the monthly payment's clear. 3 days of paperwork later, the lease traced back to a corporate account registered to a company called Vela Consulting Group, LLC. Vela Consulting Group did not appear to have a website. It did not appear to have a physical office. What it did have was a registered agent address in a strip mall in Redmond, a business license issued 18 months ago, and an operating account at a regional bank that received regular wire transfers from a subsidiary of Whitmore Systems. I was sitting in Margaret's conference room when her investigator, a former financial crimes detective named Roy Adkins, laid that last piece of information on the table. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s who communicated almost entirely in understatement, which I had come to understand was his way of softening blows he'd delivered too bluntly before. "The subsidiary in question," Roy said, sliding a single printed page across the table, "is a technology licensing entity called Meridian IP Holdings. It was incorporated 3 years ago." I looked at the page. "I know Meridian. It holds some of our legacy software patents. Damien set it up as a tax structure. I signed off on the formation." "Yes, ma'am. What you may not have known is that Meridian has been making irregular distributions to Vela Consulting for the past 22 months. The transfers are coded as contractor payments, consulting fees." "For what consulting?" Roy looked at me steadily. "That's what we haven't been able to determine yet, because Vela Consulting, as far as we can tell, has never performed any services for Meridian or for Whitmore Systems." The number at the bottom of the page was $847,000. I read it twice. I kept my face very still. I had learned to do that in boardrooms. Keep your face still while your mind is running hard in another direction. "That money came from my company," I said. "From a subsidiary of your company." "Yes." "And it went to a company that doesn't actually do anything." "Correct." I set the page down. "And the Range Rover is leased by that same shell company." "Yes, ma'am." I thought about the white Range Rover parked 2 spaces from Damien's car at 7 in the morning. I thought about the expression on Damien's face at that fundraiser 8 months ago. "Find out who drives it," I said. "I want a name." Roy nodded. He already had one, I could tell. He was waiting to see if I was ready to hear it. I looked at him. "Tell me." He reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph. It had been taken from a distance, with a long lens. The kind of photograph that felt like surveillance, because it was. A woman walking across a parking lot toward the white Range Rover. Late 30s, perhaps early 40s. Dark hair, expensive coat, the kind of posture that comes from years of being looked at. I recognized her. The recognition didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, the way it does when you see someone outside the context where you know them and your brain has to catch up. The hair was different. She'd cut it shorter and highlighted it. She was wearing clothes that cost more than anything she'd owned when I knew her. But the way she walked, that I remembered. That particular way of moving through a space as though she was always slightly aware of being watched. "Vanessa Cole," I said. The name came out of me quietly, almost carefully. The way you say a word in a foreign language that you're not sure you're pronouncing correctly. Roy said nothing. He didn't need to. "Awesome. I need to tell you about Vanessa Cole, because if I don't, you won't understand the particular quality of what I felt when I saw that photograph. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something more specific and more nauseating than betrayal. It was the recognition that the most generous thing I had ever done for another person had been used to destroy me. 12 years ago, Vanessa Cole arrived at Whitmore Systems as a 26-year-old administrative assistant. She had been hired by our HR department through a temp agency, a stopgap hire to cover a maternity leave. I wouldn't have known her at all, except that she showed up on a Thursday afternoon when I was in the middle of a minor catastrophe involving a misscheduled investor call and a conference room that had double booked, and she quietly solved both problems within 40 minutes without anyone asking her to. I noticed that. I've always noticed competence. It's one of my better qualities and probably one of my worst ones. I tend to collect capable people, and I don't always ask enough questions about who they are before I invest in them. Over the following weeks, I paid attention to Vanessa. She was quick, she was organized, she was hungry in the way that people are when they're trying to climb out of something. I asked about her background. She'd grown up in Spokane, community college for 2 years before money ran out, been working administrative jobs since she was 19. Smart enough for more, lacking the credentials to get there. I pulled her aside one afternoon and asked her if she wanted to talk about her future. She looked at me like nobody had ever asked her that question before. Over the next 3 years, I sponsored her education. Tuition for a business degree at the University of Washington covered out of my personal accounts, not the company's. I mentored her through it. I brought her along to meetings so she could learn how the company operated. I introduced her to people in the industry. When she graduated, I gave her a real job, junior operations manager, with a path to grow. I did it because I believed in her. And I'll be honest with you, I also did it because I had never been able to have a daughter. And Vanessa was the age my daughter would have been, and there was a grief in me that found something like comfort in her. I never said that to her. I'm saying it now because it's true and because the truth of it makes what she did sharper. She left Whitmore Systems 4 years ago. She told me she'd received an offer from a tech firm in San Francisco and wanted to take the leap. I told her I was proud of her. I hugged her in the lobby on her last day. She cried, and I believed the tears were real. Now she was driving a car leased by a shell company that had stolen nearly $1 million from the company I built. I sat in that conference room and I understood for the first time what people mean when they say the floor drops out from under you. Not grief, not anger, something prior to both of those. A raw, physical recognition that the world contains a particular kind of cruelty that you cannot prepare for, no matter how careful you are. Because I had not been careless, I had been kind, and in the end, the kindness was the weapon. Well, Roy gave me 2 days to absorb what he'd told me. Then he came back with more. The Range Rover wasn't the only vehicle registered to Vela Consulting. There was also a black Audi SUV, registered 18 months ago, and a property. What property? I asked. Roy slid another page across the table. A real estate record. A 4-bedroom house in Mercer Island, purchased 14 months ago for $1.4 million by a holding entity called Cascade Residential Trust. Cascade Residential Trust managing member was listed as, and here Roy paused in that understated way of his, a company called Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. I had never heard of Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. How is that possible? I asked. Something with the Whitmore name. I would have signed the formation documents. You did, Roy said. He set another page in front of me. My signature on an LLC formation agreement, dated 14 months ago. Do you recall signing this? I stared at it. The date was during the period when my father had first been diagnosed, when I was flying back and forth to Portland every other week, managing his care alongside managing the company, when I had been sleeping badly and eating badly and signing things when Damien put them in front of me and told me they were routine. He told me it was a restructuring document, I said slowly. Something about simplifying the company's holding structure. My own voice sounded strange to me, very far away. Mrs. Whitmore, Roy said, and his tone had shifted into something careful. I need to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear. Tell me. We've obtained surveillance records from the Mercer Island property. Camera footage from a neighbor's system that covers the street. Damien Whitmore's personal vehicle appears at that address an average of 3 to 4 nights per week, going back at least 11 months. 3 to 4 nights a week for 11 months. While I believed he was working late, or traveling for client meetings, or sleeping in the guest room because one of us had a cold. And Vanessa? My voice was steady. I was making it be steady. Yes, ma'am, she lives there. Full-time, as far as we can tell. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Just one. There's something else, Roy said. I opened them. Go ahead. He laid down a third photograph, the same long lens quality as the first, this one showing Vanessa on the front porch of the Mercer Island house. She was holding a child, a boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, dark-haired, standing beside her rather than being carried, looking up at a man whose back was to the camera. The man's posture I would have known anywhere. How old is the child? I asked. We believe 5, possibly just turned 5. I did the math without wanting to. 5 years ago, Vanessa was still at Whitmore Systems, still coming to me with career questions, still having lunch with me twice a month, still accepting my mentorship with those large, grateful eyes. 5 years ago, she was already sleeping with my husband. I sat with that for a moment. I let myself feel the full weight of it, Not the abstract betrayal of a woman I barely knew, but the specific horror of understanding that during the years when I was most invested in her future, when I was proudest of what she'd become, she had been in my home, at my dinner table, exchanging glances with the man I slept beside. And she had been pregnant, and neither of them had said a word. Is the child Damien's? My voice was very quiet. We don't know yet, Roy said. That's something we'd need DNA to establish. I nodded. I filed that away for later. There was a part of me, a cold, methodical part that I'd always relied on and never been more grateful for, that understood I could not afford to get lost in any single piece of this. The emotional devastation was real, and I wasn't pretending it wasn't. But I had built a company. I knew that when everything is falling apart, you triage. You decide what matters most right now, and you move toward it. The money, I said. $847,000. Where is it now? Roy looked almost relieved that I'd asked. That's where it gets more complicated. Vela Consulting made outgoing transfers to 2 additional entities, a company in Nevada called Western Bright Solutions, and a personal account in the name of a Marcus Cole. Marcus Cole, I repeated. Vanessa's brother. He lives in Tacoma. He operates a logistics company that, according to our records, has received roughly $300,000 from these transfers over the past 18 months. So it was a network, not just Damien, not just Vanessa, her family, her brother, a whole structure of hands reaching into the company I had built, passing money between themselves through entities designed to look like legitimate business activity. I had given Vanessa Cole a career, and she had brought her family into my house and let them clean it out. I stood up from the conference room table and walked to the window. Seattle was gray and rainy in the way it always is in November, the kind of weather that feels less like weather and more like the sky committing to a mood. I stood there for a long time without speaking. Behind me, I heard Roy gather his papers quietly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I want you to know, in 15 years of doing this work, I have seen a lot of fraud cases, a lot of betrayals, and I want you to know that what you're doing right now, staying in that chair, staying focused, not picking up the phone, and blowing the whole thing up, that's harder than it sounds. Most people can't do it. I didn't turn around. I'm not most people. No, ma'am, he said. I can see that. That night, alone in the hotel room that had become my temporary life, I let myself fall apart a little. Not completely. I'm not someone who falls apart completely. It's a character flaw, maybe. Or maybe just a survival mechanism so deeply embedded that I can't separate it from who I am anymore. But I sat on the edge of the bed and I let the feeling come. All of it, the grief and the rage, and underneath both of those something sadder and quieter that I didn't have a clean word for. I thought about a dinner, maybe 7 years ago. Vanessa at our dining room table, Damien refilling her wine glass, the 3 of us talking about the company's expansion plans. I had been so pleased, so genuinely, uncomplicated pleased, to have someone young and bright at our table who looked at the work we'd done with real admiration. I thought about Damien's hand on my shoulder as we walked her to the door that night. She's going to go far, he'd said. Had it already started by then? Had they already found their way to each other? Or was it still in its early stages, the careful sideways drift of 2 people choosing each other, while one of them smiled at the wife and the other one said goodnight? I would never know the exact timeline. And the not knowing was its own kind of torment. What I kept returning to, though, what I couldn't let go of, was Vanessa's face at our last lunch together, 6 weeks before she told me she was leaving for San Francisco. She'd ordered a salad she didn't eat. She'd been distracted, checking her phone more than usual. I'd asked her if everything was all right. I'm just tired, she said. A lot going on. I'd reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Whatever it is, you can tell me, I said. You know that. She had looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were wet, I realized now. I had thought she was touched by my offer. I had thought it was gratitude. What was she actually feeling in that moment? Guilt? Had she wanted to tell me? Or was she simply calculating, deciding in that pause that the money and the man and the life they were building together was worth the silence? I would never know that either, and that was the thing that sat heaviest in my chest that night. Not the money, not even the fake divorce, The thing that sat heaviest was the specific betrayal of a woman I had loved like a daughter choosing to destroy me anyway. Some wounds teach you a lesson about other people. This one taught me something about myself, about the way I had mistaken gratitude for loyalty and connection for safety. I had been wrong. It hurt to be that wrong. But being wrong wasn't the same as being finished. But the following week, Margaret Chen filed an emergency motion to freeze all assets connected to Vela Consulting, Whitmore Family Holdings, Meridian IP Holdings, and any account directly linked to Vanessa Cole or Marcus Cole. At the same time, she engaged a forensic accounting firm, a firm that specialized in corporate fraud cases and had worked with the SEC to begin a full audit of Whitmore Systems' subsidiary structure. I sat in on the first meeting with the forensic team. There were 4 of them: the lead accountant, a woman named Dr. Susan Park, and 3 junior analysts who communicated primarily in spreadsheet columns. They were thorough in the way that makes your skin prickle. They asked questions I hadn't expected about things I hadn't thought to look at. "Who controlled the signature authority on Meridian IP Holdings?" Dr. Park asked, on the second hour of that first meeting. "Damien and I had co-authority in theory," I said, "but in practice, Damien managed the subsidiary operations. I was focused on the parent company's client relationships and strategic development. So in practice, he had unilateral access." "Yes." She made a note. "And who prepared the subsidiary's annual filings?" "Our corporate accounting firm, Hendricks and Associates." "Did you review those filings personally?" I paused. "I reviewed summaries. Damien typically met with Hendricks directly. He'd bring me a 1-page overview." Dr. Park looked at me over her reading glasses, not unkindly, but directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to gently suggest that what we're likely going to find is a pattern of strategic information management, where the person with access to the detail controlled what the person with authority actually knew. You're telling me Damien managed what I understood about my own company. I'm telling you it appears that way, and it's more common than you'd think in partnerships where one person handles the technical infrastructure. The technical person controls the data controls the decisions, and the oversight becomes dependent on what the technical person chooses to show. Damien, who had joined my company when I was already running it, Damien, who had built himself into the center of the company's technological infrastructure over 27 years. Damien, who had once said, casually, at a dinner party, "Eleanor is the face of the company. I'm the engine." I had laughed at that, I remembered. I had thought it was a compliment. "What are we looking at in terms of total exposure?" I asked. Dr. Park exchanged a glance with one of her analysts. "We're still in early stages, but based on what we've seen, we're confident the 847,000 is a floor, not a ceiling." "A floor." "Give me your best estimate," I said. "Somewhere between $1.2 and $1.8 million over approximately 3 to 4 years," she said. "Possibly more depending on what we find in the subsidiary's off-book accounts." I sat with that number. A floor of $847,000, a likely total of over $1 million. That was the cost of 2 years of Damien's other life. The house on Mercer Island, the leased vehicles, Vanessa's lifestyle, her brother's business, all of it funded by the company I had started on a yellow legal pad with nothing but ambition and the terrifying conviction that I was capable of something real. "All right," I said. "Tell me what you need from me to finish the audit." While the forensic team worked, Margaret Chen's office was quietly building the fraud case around the forged divorce. The notarized signature on the dissolution filing had been matched, through handwriting analysis and a subpoena of the hospice's document records, to a notary public named Calvin Breer, who operated out of a mobile notary service in Kirkland. Calvin Breer, it turned out, had performed notary services for Vanessa Cole on 3 previous occasions. When Roy Adkins paid Calvin Breer a visit and explained that he was facing potential criminal charges for fraudulent notarization of a court document, Calvin Breer needed less than 20 minutes to provide a written statement. Margaret called me with the news on a Thursday afternoon. "He says Vanessa Cole approached him 8 months ago," Margaret said. "She told him it was a routine signature verification for an estate matter. She had your identification, your driver's license, a copy of your passport. She had a signature template. A signature template, I repeated. Something she could have obtained from any document you'd signed and she'd handled during her time at the company. I thought about the years of documents Vanessa had passed between me and various parties. Letters, agreements, authorizations. How many times had my signature passed through her hands? He signed off on it, I said. He did. He says he didn't know what the underlying document was. She told him it was a real estate transfer. We believe that's partially true and partially self-serving, but either way, his statement gives us a documented chain connecting Vanessa directly to the fraudulent filing. Can we connect Damien to it? Not directly, not yet. Calvin Breer dealt with Vanessa only. But the filing itself includes procedural details about the Whitmore household, financial disclosures, property listings, that Vanessa couldn't have known without access to information only Damien had. The circumstantial case is strong. We're going to need his communication records. Subpoena them, I said. Already in motion. I thanked her and hung up, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of the hotel room that was becoming, reluctantly, a kind of home. 4 weeks now since I'd been back to the house. Damien had sent 3 text messages, one asking where I was, one saying he was worried, one suggesting we should talk about my father's estate when I was ready. I had not responded to any of them. Margaret had advised against it. The hardest part of those 4 weeks had not been the investigations or the legal proceedings or even the financial revelations. The hardest part had been maintaining the performance of normalcy, answering emails from the office as though everything was fine, joining a board call from a hotel bathroom because the acoustics were better, going through the motions of a life that was currently being disassembled and reconstructed simultaneously. My assistant, Faye, had covered for my absence at the office with the official story that I was taking bereavement leave after my father's death, which was true enough. The grief was real enough. It just had more layers than anyone at the company knew. One afternoon, about 3 weeks in, Faye called me directly. "Eleanor," she said, and she was the only person in the office other than Damien who called me by my first name, a habit from 22 years of working together. "Is there anything you need to tell me?" I was quiet for a moment. "Yes. What makes you ask?" "Because Damien has been in the system server room twice this week for extended periods," she said, "which he never does. He usually has the IT staff handle anything physical. And this morning he asked me for the login credentials for your executive email archive account." I went very still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't have authorization to provide that without your direct consent, and I made him put the request in writing." A beat. "I've been your assistant for 22 years, Eleanor. I know when something's wrong." I closed my eyes. 22 years. Faye had watched me build this company. She had seen me through the near bankruptcy in 2007, through the death of my mother, through every bruising negotiation and every breakthrough. She had kept more of my secrets than she'd ever been asked to keep. "I'm going to need you to trust me for a little longer," I said quietly. "Can you do that?" "I've trusted you for 22 years, she said. "I'm not stopping now." "Lock my executive archive, change the access credentials, and don't share them with anyone. Tell Damien the system is undergoing a security review." A pause. "Done. Anything else?" "If he accesses the main server room again, I want to know within the hour." "Understood." Another pause. "Eleanor, are you safe?" The question caught me off guard. Not physically safe. That wasn't what she meant. She meant, "Are you okay? Is this going to break you?" I thought about the cold clarity I'd felt sitting in my car in the driveway the night I found out about the divorce. That particular species of fury that doesn't burn hot and exhausts itself. The kind that burns low and steady and keeps burning. "I'm fine, Faye," I said. "I'll call you if he moves wrong," she said, and hung up. He moved wrong the next morning. Faye texted at 7:42 a.m. "He's in the server room. Brought someone I don't recognize. Young guy, laptop bag, not from our IT team." I called Roy Adkins immediately. "He's trying to access the systems," I said. "He may be attempting to hide or destroy financial records." "How quickly can your cybersecurity team be deployed?" Roy asked. "Margaret has them on standby. I'll call her now." "Do it fast. If he's in the infrastructure, he's already started." Margaret's cybersecurity specialist, a woman named Carla Hines, who had previously worked digital forensics for the FBI, was in a vehicle outside the Whitmore Systems building within 40 minutes. She accessed the company's network remotely through a back door Margaret had arranged through the board's emergency authority, established 2 weeks earlier when I'd quietly briefed 2 of our 3 independent board members about the situation. Carla called me at 9:15 a.m. He tried to delete transaction records from the Meridian subsidiary's internal ledger, she said, with the flat, informational tone of someone who had seen worse things before breakfast. Initiated a wipe command on 3 archived folders. I intercepted it. Did it complete? No, I got a mirror of everything before the wipe command executed. The original files are preserved. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. He knows, I said. Possibly. Or he's been planning this for a while and the timeline finally got urgent. Either way, Mrs. Whitmore, whatever you're planning to do, I'd recommend you do it soon. He's aware that someone is looking. I called Margaret next. We need to move up the timeline, I said. How much time do we have? I don't know, days maybe. He's starting to cover his tracks. A pause on her end while she calculated. The criminal referral for the fraud is ready. The financial evidence package is 90% assembled. The notary statement is in hand. I could hear her thinking. There's one gap I wanted to close before we moved. The DNA question. The child. I hadn't forgotten. I'd set it aside, filed it under later, told myself it didn't change the criminal case. And it didn't change the criminal case. But it was a thread that left loose could complicate things. Damien might use the child as a sympathy lever, might paint himself as a father protecting his family, might try to reframe the narrative. What would it take? I asked. We'd need a sample without his knowledge, Margaret said. Something he discarded, a cup, a utensil. Roy's team has been on the Mercer Island property. It's possible. Tell Roy, I said. Tell him we need it in the next 48 hours. I hung up. Outside the hotel window, Seattle was doing what Seattle does in November, putting on a gray, relentless drizzle that seems designed to outlast you. I stood at the glass and watched the street below, the people with their umbrellas in their ordinary mornings, the cars moving in their ordinary patterns. 22 months of stolen money, a secret house, a child who might or might not be Damien's son, a forged divorce, a woman I'd spent 3 years pouring hope into, who had spent those years and more using everything I gave her to help someone take everything from me. Roy called back in 36 hours. We have a sample, he said, coffee cup from a trash receptacle outside the property. I've sent it to the lab on a rush order, 72 hours for results. Good, I said. Mrs. Whitmore, there's one more thing. Damien made a call this morning from his personal cell. We're not monitoring that line directly, but our contact at the phone carrier flagged an unusual call pattern. A number called multiple times in the last 48 hours that he'd never called before. Whose number? An attorney, Roy said. Corporate and criminal defense. One of the better ones in Seattle. I absorbed that. Damien was lawyering up, which meant he knew something was coming, which meant we were closer to each other than I'd realized. 2 people moving in the dark toward the same collision, both pretending they couldn't see it. The investor presentation was in 3 weeks, the biggest single event in Whitmore Systems history, 400 executives, a projected $60 million funding commitment, the kind of moment that could define a company's next decade. I had known for weeks that whatever happened, it was going to happen around that event. Damien knew the company's value. If he was going to threaten anything, that was where he'd aim. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. He's retained criminal defense counsel, I said. I know, she said. My contact at the bar flagged it this morning. Then we have 3 weeks. Yes. Is that enough time? She paused, and in that pause I heard her run through everything we had and everything we still needed. It'll have to be, she said. I stood at the window a moment longer. The drizzle had turned to proper rain, streaking down the glass in long diagonal lines, and in the reflection I could see my own face, 68 years old, tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, but steady. There was a version of this story where I had never found that envelope, where my father's estate had been processed through accounts Damien had access to, where the $4 million had quietly been absorbed into the same financial architecture he'd been building for years, and I had gone back to the house and gone back to my life and never known. That version of the story still frightened me more than the one I was actually living, because in that version, I had not been destroyed. I had simply been disappeared, quietly, thoroughly, by someone who'd decided I was no longer necessary, and I hadn't even known to resist. I was grateful, in a grim and unwilling way, for the white envelope in the foyer. I was grateful for Gerald Fossey and his careful discrepancy. I was grateful for Patricia in Portland, who'd answered her phone at 9 o'clock and told me the truth. I was not going to waste the warning. 3 weeks. Whatever Damian Whitmore had planned for that investor presentation, I was going to be ready. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday. Roy Adkins called me at 8 in the morning, which was earlier than he usually called, and that alone told me something before he said a word. I was sitting at the small desk in the hotel room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, going over the forensic accounting team's latest summary when my phone buzzed across the table. "The lab results are in," he said. "And?" A beat. "The child is not Damian Whitmore's biological son." I set down my pen. I had prepared myself for both outcomes. I had told myself it didn't change the legal case, didn't alter the fraud charges or the forged divorce or the embezzlement, and that was true. But I sat there for a moment and let the specific weight of that information settle over me. Because even now, even after everything I knew, there was something in me that had still been holding out some small, foolish hope that the thing with Vanessa had been a lapse, an accident, a human failure, rather than a calculated long game. A child you'd told another man was his was not an accident. That was architecture. That was a structure built over years, with intention. "Does Damian know?" I asked. "We have no way of confirming that," Roy said. "But based on what we know about Vanessa, her pattern of behavior, the degree of planning involved in the rest of this, I'd say it's unlikely she told him." "So he believes that boy is his son?" "Almost certainly." I thought about Damian in the server room, frantically trying to delete files. I thought about the criminal defense attorney he'd retained. I thought about a man who had stolen from his wife, fraudulently dissolved their marriage, and built a secret life over years of careful deception, and who had, in all probability, been deceived himself in the most personal way imaginable. I did not feel sorry for him, but I filed the information away with the same cold precision I'd been applying to everything for the past 5 weeks. Because in 3 weeks, in a ballroom full of investors, that information was going to matter. "Roy," I said, "I need everything documented. The lab results, the chain of custody for the sample, everything the results would require to be admissible." "Already in motion," he said. "Good." I paused. "Is there anything else this morning?" "One thing. Damian's defense attorney made a call to our corporate law firm yesterday, Hendrick's legal arm, not the accounting side. He's testing to see who's loyal and who's not. Your corporate counsel should know." "I'll call Margaret." I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet. Outside, Seattle was putting on one of its rare, clear November mornings, the kind where the sky goes a deep, almost aggressive blue, and the light off the water is sharp enough to hurt. I looked at it for a few seconds. Then I called Margaret. Margaret Chen had a way of receiving bad news that I had come to deeply respect. She didn't perform alarm. She didn't reassure you with empty phrases. She just absorbed the information and immediately began reconfiguring around it, the way a good chess player reconfigures around an unexpected move. "He's testing the firm," she said, when I told her about the call to Hendrick's legal team. "He wants to know if anyone there has been cooperating with us." "Has anyone there been cooperating with us?" "Not directly. We've worked around Hendrick's entirely. Your forensic team is independent, my team is independent, and the board communications have gone through me directly. But Damian doesn't know what we know about the network of information we have. So from his perspective, the most dangerous leak point is probably the accounting firm." "Is it?" "No. The most dangerous leak point, from his perspective, should be himself. But people who build the kind of system he built tend to overestimate their own security." She paused. "I want to move up the board communication, the 2 independent directors who know the basics. They need the full picture now before Damien can get to them. Agreed. Set it up. I'll have something scheduled by tomorrow morning. Another pause. And the confrontation. We've been discussing the timing of it. Has anything changed on your end? I had been thinking about this for days. The question of when to confront Damien directly. Margaret had initially advised against it entirely. Let the legal process do the work, she'd said. Don't give him the chance to lawyer up in real time. But Carla Hines had made something clear after the server room incident. Damien was already moving. He was already taking protective actions. And a man who was already preparing his defense was a man who might do something unpredictable. There was also something else. Something I hadn't discussed with Margaret because it was harder to frame as a legal strategy and easier to frame as a human need. I needed to hear him say it. I know how that sounds. I know that needing to hear someone confess is not a legal strategy. I know that confrontation is emotionally satisfying in the moment and often strategically disastrous. I had told myself all of those things repeatedly over the past 5 weeks, in the quiet of the hotel room, and in the middle of the night when I lay awake going over everything for the 100th time. But there was something in me, something I couldn't entirely silence, that needed to stand in front of Damien Whitmore and hear him explain himself. Not because I thought his explanation would make sense, not because I expected remorse, but because 31 years of marriage deserved at minimum the dignity of being spoken out loud. I'm going to meet with him, I said. Margaret was quiet for a beat. Eleanor, I know what you're going to say. I'm going to say that anything you say in that meeting can be used against you if he records it, and I'm going to say that anything he says in that meeting will be useless to us unless it's recorded properly and legally. Then I'll record it properly and legally. Another pause. Washington is a 2-party consent state. You'd need to disclose the recording. I'm not planning to hide it, I said. I'm going to tell him I'm recording it, and I'm going to watch what he does with that information. That's... She stopped. I could hear her recalibrating. That's actually not the worst approach I've ever heard. If he keeps talking anyway, everything he says is admissible. And if he shuts down the moment you mention it, that's its own kind of information. That's what I'm thinking. I want one of my associates on standby outside whatever location you choose, and I want you wired additionally, not for legal recording purposes, just for your safety. Fine, I said. When? I thought about it. The investor presentation was in 17 days. Damien's attorney was already making probe calls. Carla had intercepted the server room deletion attempt. The whole structure was tightening, from both directions. This week, I said. I'll set it up for Thursday. What? I called Damien at 10 o'clock Wednesday morning from a number he didn't have, a temporary line I'd obtained through Roy's office. He answered on the third ring with the careful neutrality of a man who had been answering unknown numbers with caution lately. This is Damien Whitmore. It's Eleanor, I said. The silence that followed was one of the most informative silences I have ever experienced. Not long, but 3-4 seconds at most, but dense with something I could almost hear him working through. Surprise, certainly. Calculation. And underneath both of those, something that might have been fear, though with Damien it was always difficult to separate fear from the performance of control. Eleanor. His voice shifted into warmth immediately, that practiced warmth I had once loved and now recognized as a layer of paint over something much colder. I've been so worried. Where are you? Are you all right? I'd like to meet, I said. Thursday, the office, after hours, 7 o'clock. Of course. Can you tell me what this is about? We'll talk Thursday, I said, and hung up. I arrived at the Whitmore Systems building at 6:45. The offices were mostly empty at that hour. A few developers working late, a security guard at the front desk who had worked evenings for 11 years, and greeted me with the same nod he always did. I took the elevator to the executive floor and sat in my own office for the first time in 5 weeks. It felt strange, not unwelcoming. The office was mine, had always been mine. My name was on the building's founding documents and on every patent filing we'd ever made. But 5 weeks of distance had given the space an unfamiliarity, the way your own face looks wrong after you've been staring at it too long. I turned on the small recorder Margaret's associate had helped me configure earlier that afternoon. Then I set my phone on the desk, visible, and waited. Damien arrived at 7:03. He was wearing the charcoal blazer he'd had for years, the one he wore when he wanted to appear approachable rather than authoritative. He looked, I noticed, tired. Not the ordinary tired of overwork, the specific tiredness of a person who had been managing too many things in too many directions for too long. He stopped when he saw me sitting behind the desk, and for just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name. Then he arranged himself into something easier and more familiar, and he came forward and sat down across from me. "Eleanor," he said. He glanced around the room as though taking inventory. "It's good to see you. You look—" "I'm recording this conversation," I said. "I'm telling you that directly, as required. Everything said in this room tonight will be recorded." He went very still. I watched him. This was the moment Margaret had predicted would be most telling, the moment he decided, in real time, whether to stay or shut down. A man with nothing to hide gets annoyed, maybe. Gets defensive about the recording, asks why. Damien looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression that I hadn't expected. The warmth drained out, and what was underneath wasn't hostility. It was something that looked almost like relief, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and had finally been given permission to exhale. "All right," he said. Just that. "All right." He leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms and looked at me, and for the first time in the entire 5 weeks since I'd found the divorce decree, I felt the specific chill of encountering someone who had already decided something long before you walked into the room. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. "I want you to tell me yourself. All of it." He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because I want to hear you say it, in your own words, not from a report and not from someone else's account. 31 years, Damien. I think I'm owed that much." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. I want to be precise about this, because the story I tell myself about that night matters to me. It wasn't guilt. It was closer to assessment. He was deciding, even now, what to give me and what to withhold, and how much truth was strategically useful versus how much would cost him. Then he nodded, slowly, and he began to talk. He had met Vanessa again, not at the company, but at an industry conference in Portland, 4 years after she'd left Whitmore Systems. He told it flatly, without embellishment, the way people tell stories they've rehearsed in their own heads enough times that the feeling has been worn smooth. "I wasn't looking for it," he said. "I'm sure," I said, and my voice was even. "I mean that literally. Eleanor, I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I was just—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "We hadn't been the same for a long time. You know that. I know you told me we were fine, because you didn't want to hear otherwise." His voice had an edge now. "Every time I tried to—" "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't make this about what I didn't want to hear. You made choices, Damien. Make them in your own name." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes, I made choices. Vanessa and it became more than it should have. And then she told me she was pregnant. I kept my face still. And you believe the child was yours." His eyes met mine. "He is mine." I said nothing. "He's 5 years old, and he calls me Dad, and he is my son," Damien said, and there was something real in his voice now, something underneath the calculation. The first genuine emotion I'd heard from him since he walked through the door. "Whatever you think of me, whatever I've done, he's real and he's mine, and that's not negotiable." I let that sit for a moment. I thought about the DNA results sitting in Margaret's office. I thought about Roy Adkins and his understated delivery of news that broke things open. I chose not to tell him. Not yet. Not tonight. "Tell me about the money," I said instead. He exhaled. "It was supposed to be temporary. The house? Vanessa needed stability. The baby was coming, and I didn't have liquid assets that weren't tied to the company. So I used the subsidiary structure." "You stole from the company." "I borrowed—" "You stole, Damien. Call it what it is." His jaw tightened. "I set up entities to manage cash flow. I plan to unwind them." Over $1 million, I said. That's not a cash flow management tool. That's a second life, funded by the business I started. He had the grace to look away. And the divorce? My voice stayed flat. I was proud of that flatness. I had practiced it in the hotel room for days. Walk me through the divorce. The pause that followed was longer than any of the others, and when he spoke again, the flat, rehearsed quality was gone. What replaced it was something raw, not remorse exactly. Discomfort. The discomfort of a man being asked to own the thing he most wanted to distance himself from. Your father's estate, BM, he said. When Gerald Fossey started the estate process, I knew the asset tracing would eventually flag the subsidiaries. I needed the divorce finalized before the estate transferred, so your inheritance would be classified as separate property, outside the marital estate, outside any claims I might face if everything unraveled. I stared at him. You divorced me to protect yourself from the fraud you were committing. I divorced you because the marriage was already over and I needed to structure the legal situation correctly. You forged my signature. That was Vanessa's. He stopped. I waited. That was handled by Vanessa, he said more quietly. With your knowledge. He didn't answer, which was an answer. I sat with the wreckage of that for a moment. 31 years, the maple tree in the front yard, the yellow legal pad on the kitchen table in 1989. Every board meeting and every bad quarter and every breakthrough, standing beside this man, believing we were partners in something that mattered. He had looked at all of it, all of those years, and decided that the risk of me finding out about the money was more dangerous than the crime of erasing our marriage on paper while I sat in a hospice hallway watching my father die. You knew I'd be distracted, I said slowly. You planned it for when my father was dying. He didn't deny it. He looked at me with that tired, flat expression, and he did not deny it. Something in me went very quiet. I want you to understand something, he said then, and his voice had shifted again, back toward the cold precision of a man who had something left to play. I've been running this company's technical infrastructure for 27 years. Every system, every code base, every security architecture. The investor presentation is in 17 days. I have administrative access to the entire software stack, access that, if removed or interrupted, would make the system unstable in ways that would be extremely visible to the 200 executives and 40 institutional investors sitting in that ballroom. I looked at him. I'm telling you this directly, he said, because you said you wanted the truth. That's the truth. Whatever you're building with your attorneys and your investigators, and yes, I know you're building something, I need you to understand that the company's value on that day and the deal that you've spent 2 years constructing rests on systems that I control. There it was. Not a request, not a negotiation. A weapon laid on the table between us in the plain language of a man who had decided that offense was his only remaining option. Are you threatening to destroy the company? I asked. I'm explaining the situation. That's the same thing. Eleanor? His voice went almost gentle, which was worse than the threat. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to find a resolution that works for both of us. You walk away with your father's inheritance, which is protected as separate property under the divorce decree. The company continues, the deal closes. Nobody goes to prison. Except you've already committed fraud, I said. Multiple counts, the embezzlement, the forged filing, the fraudulent notarization. Those aren't things I can walk away from by choosing not to look. They're things that are very difficult to prove without the company's internal records, he said. Records that exist on systems I control. I looked at him for a long moment, and I thought about Carla Hines, who had been in the company's network for 3 weeks. I thought about the mirror she'd made of every file before his deletion command ran. I thought about the forensic team's records, sitting in Margaret's office in physical and cloud-duplicated storage that had nothing to do with Whitmore Systems infrastructure. I thought about the subpoenaed bank records, and the notary's written statement and Roy Adkins' documented surveillance chain. I thought about the fact that there was not a single piece of evidence we were relying on that lived on a server Damian Whitmore could reach. I did not say any of that. I said, "I need some time to think about what you've told me." He nodded slowly. The ghost of something that might have been satisfaction moved across his face, the expression of a man who believes he has successfully deployed his strongest card and is watching it land. "I think that's wise," he said. "I'll be in touch," I said. "Through my attorney." He stood, buttoned his blazer. At the door he paused and turned back, and for one moment I saw something on his face that was neither calculation nor performance, something older and more complicated, a fragment of the man I had actually known, looking at me from the ruins of what we'd made together. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't want it to be like this." I looked at him. "Yes, you did," I said. "You wanted it to be clean and quiet, and you wanted me not to notice. The only thing you didn't want was this, me in this chair, having already seen everything. That's the only part you didn't want." He left. I sat in the office for a long time after I heard the elevator close. The recorder was still running. I reached over and stopped it. My hand was steady, which surprised me a little, even now. Then I picked up my phone and called Margaret. "I have everything," I said. What came next was not the clean, satisfying machinery of justice that people imagine when they think about legal recourse. It was 3 weeks of controlled, exhausting, multi-front work that required more simultaneous focus than anything I had ever managed in 30 years of running a business. Margaret's team worked with the King County Prosecutor's Office to file the criminal referral for the fraudulent divorce filing, naming Vanessa Cole and Calvin Breer and leaving Damian as a subject of the ongoing fraud investigation. The embezzlement case was handed to the SEC's Civil Enforcement Division alongside the criminal referral. The scale of the corporate fraud, combined with the shell company structure, qualified it for federal review. The forensic accounting team delivered their final report. Total misappropriated funds of $1.47 million, spread across 22 months of transactions coded as legitimate contractor payments. At the same time, Carla Hines and her cybersecurity team went to work on the infrastructure problem. I want to be clear about this, because it matters. We did not delete Damian's access to the company's systems. That would have been disruptive and potentially actionable. What Carla did was something more precise. She mapped every backdoor, every administrative override, every hidden access point that Damian had built into the system over 27 years. She documented them. And then, working from the outside, she built a parallel security architecture around the existing one, a layer of verification and failsafe that meant any command executed through Damian's credentials would require secondary confirmation from a system he didn't control. It took her team 11 days working around the clock. On the 12th day, she called me. "We're done," she said. "He can still log in, he can still see his dashboard. He can even attempt to execute system commands. But if he tries to kill the investor presentation systems, the override will fail silently, and a notification will route to my team in real time. He won't know it failed. Not immediately. He'll think it worked. He'll see a confirmation screen. By the time he realizes nothing actually happened, you'll be in the middle of the presentation." I thought about Damian in that office, laying his threat on the table with the careful confidence of a man holding what he believed was the only weapon in the room. "Good," I said. Meanwhile, I was managing the board. The 2 independent directors I had briefed weeks ago, a retired tech executive named Arthur Wynn and a former federal judge named Constance Abarra, had been sitting with partial information and increasing anxiety. On day 13, I brought them into a conference room at Margaret's firm and laid the complete picture in front of them. The fraud, the forged divorce, the shell companies, the cybersecurity intervention, the confrontation recording, which Margaret had obtained a formal legal opinion declaring admissible. Arthur Wynn was quiet through most of it. He was 71, had been on 3 other boards through various crises, and had the temperament of a man who had seen corporate scandals in multiple forms. When I finished, he leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. "The 3rd board member," he said, "Preston Cole." Preston Cole had been on our board for 6 years. He was a private equity contact referred by a mutual colleague, quiet and unremarkable at meetings. He had never been someone I thought about particularly. Roy Adkins had thought about him. Preston Cole, I said, is Vanessa Cole's father's cousin. Second cousin, technically. I didn't know that when he joined the board. I don't believe it was disclosed. Constance Abara, who had spent 20 years on the federal bench and had a face built for the careful withholding of reaction, let out a slow breath. He's been inside your governance structure for 6 years. Yes. Does he know what's coming? We believe he suspects something based on a call pattern Roy flagged. He's been in contact with Damien's defense attorney in the last week, but he doesn't know the scope of what we have. He needs to be removed from the board before the investor presentation, Constance said. A motion of the other board members citing undisclosed conflicts. We can do that. That's my read as well, I said. Arthur Wynne rubbed his face with both hands. A gesture that was so human, so ordinary, that it almost broke through the professional surface of that conference room. Eleanor, he said, I've known you for 14 years. I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. How are you holding up? Not the company. You. I looked at him for a moment. It was the same question Faye had asked me 6 weeks ago on the phone, and I had given Faye the same flat, competent answer I was about to give Arthur. I'm fine. I'm managing. I'm focused. But Arthur was looking at me with the particular attention of someone who had been watching capable people manage impossible things for a long time, and something in his expression made me pause. I'm angrier than I've ever been in my life, I said, and I haven't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 6 weeks. And there are days when I sit in that hotel room and I think about the fact that I am 68 years old and I'm doing this. That this is what this chapter of my life looks like, and it is very, very hard. He nodded. He didn't offer comfort or reframe it or tell me it would be okay. He just nodded. All right, he said. What do you need from us for the presentation? I need you both visible and present. I need the board's public face to be unified, and I need Preston Cole removed quietly before that day, without tipping off Damien that it's happened. We can do that, Constance said. The board motion removing Preston Cole for undisclosed conflicts of interest was filed 2 days later. He was notified by certified letter. He did not respond publicly. His attorney called Margaret's office and was told the motion was not subject to negotiation. The investor presentation was in 4 days. On the evening before the presentation, I went back to the house for the first time since October. I don't know exactly why I needed to do that. There wasn't anything there I needed. My personal documents had been transferred weeks ago through Margaret's office. My valuables secured, nothing of legal importance remained. But I needed to go back, I think, the way you need to look at something painful long enough that it loses its power over you. Damien's car wasn't in the garage. He was probably at the Mercer Island house. The house was quiet in the way of a space that's been empty for a while, a particular kind of quiet that's different from a house where people are simply sleeping. I walked through the room slowly. The kitchen where I'd written the first business plan. The study where I'd spent hundreds of late nights on the phone with investors and clients and lawyers and engineers. The living room where we'd hosted every company milestone, every holiday dinner, every birthday. I stood at the window where Damien used to stand to watch the backyard, and I looked at the maple tree he'd planted the first autumn we moved in. It was very large now, 30 years of growing, unwitnessed by anyone in particular. I thought about who I had been when we planted it. 40 years old, exhausted and exhilarated and terrified, with a company that was starting to find its footing and a marriage I believed in absolutely. I thought about who I was standing at this window now, 68, defrauded and discarded and quietly furious, 4 weeks from a legal reckoning that was going to reshape everything. The gap between those two women was the length of an entire life. I wasn't the same person. I didn't want to be. The woman who'd stood here at 40 had trusted completely, and that trust had been a door left open. The woman standing here at 68 had learned to lock the right doors and leave open the ones that actually needed air. That was a hard way to learn it, but I had learned it. I turned off the light in the living room and walked back through the house and out the front door. The night air was cold and clear, the kind of November cold that makes Seattle feel like itself, sharp and gray, and a little bracing. I sat in the car for a moment in the driveway. Tomorrow, 400 executives and institutional investors would fill a hotel ballroom and watch Damien Whitmore attempt to execute a system kill switch that would not work. They would then watch Eleanor Whitmore stand at a podium and present evidence that would end his freedom and his career in the same afternoon. And at some point during that afternoon, Damien was going to discover two things in rapid succession. First, that his system override had failed completely. And second, that the child he had sacrificed everything for, the child he had used as his reason and his justification, the living proof that he deserved a real family, was not his. I had not planned to reveal the DNA results in the ballroom. That felt gratuitous, even to me. The legal case didn't need it. The fraud was documented. The forgery was documented. The embezzlement was documented. Those charges were enough. But the results existed. And in the legal process that would follow, they would surface. And when they did, Damien would understand, in a way that no fraud charge could fully convey, what it felt like to have someone you trusted completely reshape your reality without your knowledge. I had not wished that on him deliberately. I want to be honest about that. I am not a perfect person, and I had gone through periods in those 6 weeks where I had felt things I'm not proud of, periods of cold satisfaction, imagining his exposure, periods of fantasizing about watching his face when everything collapsed. I had felt those things, and I had not pretended otherwise to myself. But sitting in the driveway of the house that had been my home for 31 years, in the cold November night, what I felt was something quieter than revenge. I felt the specific, hard-won clarity of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing and why. Tomorrow was not about punishing Damien Whitmore, though punishment would be part of what followed. Tomorrow was about something more fundamental: reclaiming what I had built. Reclaiming the company that had started on a yellow legal pad with nothing but my own conviction. Reclaiming the work and the life and the identity that someone had tried to quietly erase while I was distracted by grief. Nobody erases me. Not at 40, when the investors didn't take me seriously. Not at 50, when the board suggested I consider bringing in a more experienced CEO. Not at 68, in a probate attorney's office holding a divorce decree I never signed. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway. In 16 hours, it would begin. I drove toward the hotel through the empty streets, and I was ready in a way I hadn't been ready for anything since the morning 30 years ago when I walked into the first bank meeting and convinced a skeptical loan officer to bet on a woman with a yellow legal pad and absolutely nothing to lose. I was ready. I didn't sleep the night before. I want to say I did. I want to tell you that I was calm enough, prepared enough, that I laid down in that hotel room and closed my eyes, and the exhaustion of 7 weeks finally pulled me under. But that's not what happened. What happened was that I lay on top of the covers fully dressed until 2 in the morning, running the sequence of the next day through my mind the way I used to run presentations before the biggest pitches of my career. Every beat, every contingency, every point at which something could go sideways and what I would do if it did. At 2:15, I gave up and made coffee and sat at the small desk and read through the forensic accounting team's final summary one more time. Not because I needed to. I had it memorized by then. Every figure, every entity name, every transaction date. I read it because the act of reading it was grounding. It made the thing real in a way that the past 7 weeks of living inside it sometimes didn't. Numbers on a page don't lie the way people do. Numbers sit still and say exactly what they mean. $1,470,000 in misappropriated funds across 22 months. 47 wire transfers between Meridian YP Holdings and Vela Consulting Group. 11 transfers from Vela to Western Bright Solutions, a Nevada entity with no verifiable operations. 29 payments to a personal account held by Marcus Cole, totaling $312,000. 1 fraudulent dissolution of marriage, notarized by a man who had since given a full written statement to law enforcement. 1 forged signature on a document signed during the final weeks of my father's life. I sat with those numbers until the sky outside started going gray, and then I showered and put on the suit I had chosen 10 days earlier. Charcoal, structured, the one I always wore when I needed to walk into a room and be taken seriously from the first second. I put on the earrings my father had given me when the company first turned profitable. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. 68 years old. I had looked at myself in that mirror every day for 7 weeks and wondered, in the private space of early morning, whether I was going to be able to hold this together. Whether the grief and the betrayal and the sheer grinding weight of what I was carrying would at some point simply exceed my capacity to carry it. I was still here. I picked up my bag, checked that my phone was charged, and went down to the lobby to meet Margaret Chen. She was already there when the elevator opened, standing near the entrance with a coffee in each hand and the expression of someone who had also not slept particularly well. She handed me one of the coffees without saying anything, which was exactly right. Her associate Daniel was with her, a younger attorney, methodical and quiet, who was carrying a document case that held the physical evidence package. Behind him was Roy Adkins, in a dark jacket, looking as though he might be early for a funeral he'd attended many times before. And in a separate vehicle outside, already in position, were two representatives from the King County Prosecutor's Office and a federal agent from the SEC's Enforcement Division who had been briefed and were waiting for Margaret's signal. We had agreed that law enforcement would not enter the building until I gave the signal, a specific text to Roy, who would relay it outside. The reason for that was deliberate. I did not want Damien arrested in a side corridor quietly, out of sight of the people who needed to understand what had happened to their investment. I wanted the evidence presented in the room where the deal was supposed to close. I wanted every person in that ballroom to understand before law enforcement entered exactly what they had almost walked into. That was not purely strategic, I'll admit. It was also personal. I won't pretend otherwise. Margaret looked at me over her coffee. "How are you?" "Ready?" I said. "Any changes overnight? Anything from Carla's team?" She sent a status at midnight. "Everything is holding. His credentials are still active, the shadow layer is in place, and her team is monitoring in real time." "Good." Margaret glanced at the clock above the lobby entrance. "Doors open at 8. Damien is expected at 7:30 for setup access. Are you going in before him?" "I'm going in now," I said. 8. The Grand Meridian Hotel was 12 blocks from the Whitmore Systems building, and the ballroom on its 4th floor had been booked for this event for over a year. 420 registered attendees by institutional investors, technology executives, industry analysts, members of the regional business press. The kind of room that Whitmore Systems hadn't filled since our 10th anniversary event in 1999, and hadn't needed to fill since, because we had grown into a company that didn't need spectacle. We were quiet and profitable and respected, and the investor presentation was intended to be the capstone of a 2-year strategic expansion, a growth round that would fund a new product line and push us into markets we hadn't touched. I had spent 18 months building that deal. Damien had spent months planning to destroy it if I tried to fight back. The ballroom was being set up when I arrived. Tables and chairs in neat rows, the stage at the front with its 2 podiums, and the projection screens. The technical staff running cables and testing audio. I walked through it slowly, taking in the space the way I always did before a major event, measuring it against what I needed it to do. At the back of the room, near the service entrance, Carla Hines was standing with one of her junior team members, both of them with laptops open. She looked up when I approached. "All systems nominal," she said. "His dashboard shows everything functioning normally. He has no indication of the shadow layer. When he attempts the override, he'll see a confirmation screen that looks exactly like a successful execution, standard system response. He won't know for at least 15 to 20 minutes, and only if he's physically watching the presentation screens and realizes nothing has actually changed." She paused. "Unless he's smarter than we're giving him credit for." "He's very smart," I said, "but he's also very confident. He spent 27 years being the only person in the room who understood the infrastructure. That confidence has probably cost him more than he realizes." Carla nodded. "Then we're ready." I found Faye near the registration table, organizing materials with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been managing impossible logistics for 22 years. She looked up when she saw me, and something moved across her face. Relief, I thought, and something fiercer than relief underneath it. "You look good," she said. "I look like someone who didn't sleep." "You look like someone who's about to walk into the most important meeting of her life," she said, which is the same thing most of the time. I put my hand briefly on her arm. There wasn't anything adequate to say, so I didn't try. "Is everything ready on the presentation side?" I asked. "The deck is loaded on the backup system. Your system, the one Carla's team controls. The main display will feed from that regardless of what the primary dashboard shows. She lowered her voice. He doesn't know about the backup system? He doesn't know about any of it, I said. She nodded once, sharply, the way she nodded when she'd made a decision. Then let's go. Damien arrived at 7:22. I was standing near the stage when he came through the main entrance, and I watched him cross the room without moving toward him or away from him. He was in his best suit, navy, the one he saved for significant occasions, and he was carrying his laptop, which I noted because Carla had told me he would need to physically connect to execute the system command, and the laptop was how he planned to do it. He scanned the room when he entered. That was habit. Damien always took inventory of a space before he committed to entering it fully. His eyes found me after a few seconds, and we looked at each other across the length of the ballroom. Neither of us moved toward the other. After a moment, he nodded. A small, contained nod that meant nothing and acknowledged everything. Then he walked toward the AV station near the stage where the technical equipment was set up, and I watched him set down his laptop and begin connecting it to the presentation system with the unhurried manner of a man who believed he controlled the room. Margaret appeared at my elbow. He's here. I see him. Are you ready to begin? I looked at the room, the chairs filling with people now. As the doors opened, the quiet hum of 400 conversations beginning, the particular energy of a large room where something consequential is about to happen. I thought about my father, who had spent 60 years building something in silence and left me the resources to protect myself when I needed it most. I thought about the yellow legal pad. I thought about the maple tree in the front yard. Yes, I said. Let's begin. The formal program started at 8:30. The first 40 minutes were standard. A welcome from Arthur Wynn as board chair, an industry overview from our chief strategy officer, a financial summary presented by Dr. Susan Park in her capacity as our newly appointed interim CFO, a role she had agreed to take on 48 hours earlier when our previous CFO had been placed on administrative leave pending the fraud investigation. I watched the room during those 40 minutes. I watched the investors, most of whom were there to hear about the growth round and had no idea what else the morning held. I watched the press section, 3 rows of journalists with notebooks and recorders. And I watched Damien, who was seated at the side of the stage on the technical panel, his laptop open, his expression carrying the particular controlled calm of a man who is waiting for his moment. He had positioned himself to execute the override during the company overview segment, before the investment commitments were formalized, but after the room was full and the attention was fully engaged. I knew this because Margaret's associate had pulled the draft timing from a document found during the subpoena of his email archive. He had actually written it down. The arrogance of that still, even now, took my breath a little. At 9:14, I watched his hands move to the keyboard, and I watched him type, and I watched him pause, look at his screen, and see the confirmation message that told him the command had executed successfully. He settled back in his chair. The room around him continued its normal rhythm. A slide on the screen changed. The strategy officer moved to a new talking point. The investors in the front rows took notes. Nothing changed. Nothing flickered. The light stayed on. The presentation continued. The system ran exactly as it was supposed to run. I gave him 4 minutes. I watched his face during those 4 minutes. It was a study in the gradual erosion of certainty. So subtle that only someone looking for it would see it. A slight increase in his attention to the screen behind the stage. A small tension around his jaw. His hand moving back to the laptop, checking something, moving away again. The beginning of a frown that he controlled before it completed itself. He knew. Not everything. Not yet. But he knew that something had not gone the way he'd planned, and I could see him beginning to recalculate, beginning to consider his options, beginning to prepare the pivot. Damien was good at pivots. He had always been better than almost anyone I knew at adapting on the fly to circumstances that had changed against him. That was the part of him I had always admired. It was also the part I had prepared for most carefully. At 9:18, I walked to the podium. The room quieted when I stepped up. Not immediately. It took a few seconds, the way large rooms always do, the sound bleeding off gradually as attention focused. I stood at the podium and looked out at 400 faces, and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I had expected nerves or the cold fury that had been carrying me for 7 weeks, or some version of the grim resolve I'd arrived at in the car outside the house the night before. What I actually felt was something calmer than any of those things, almost quiet. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I founded this company 35 years ago with a yellow legal pad and a loan that took me 6 months to convince a bank to give me. I've stood at a lot of podiums in those 35 years, but I want to tell you honestly, I've never stood at one with more at stake than this one." I paused. Let the room settle fully. "I'm going to do something a little different than what's on the program this morning. I'm going to ask for your patience and your attention for the next 20 minutes, and I'm going to show you something that I believe every person in this room has the right to know before they commit a dollar to this company." The shift in the room's energy was immediate and specific. Not alarm, not yet, but the heightened attention of people who understand that something off-script is happening. In the front row, 2 of the institutional investors exchanged a look. In the press section, I saw notebooks come up. At the side of the stage, Damien had gone very still. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I looked back at the room. "Whitmore Systems has a strong future," I said. "Our technology is sound, our client base is loyal, our growth projections are realistic, and the investment opportunity we're presenting today is genuine. I want to be clear about that first because what I'm about to tell you is about the past, and the past does not define what this company can do next." I nodded to Faye, who was at the presentation controls. The first slide appeared on the screen behind me. It was a clean, simple organizational chart of Whitmore Systems' subsidiary structure, with Meridian IP Holdings highlighted in yellow. "Over the past 7 weeks," I said, "my legal team and a team of independent forensic accountants have completed an audit of this company's subsidiary entities. What they found represents one of the most painful discoveries of my professional life. And I'm choosing to present it to you directly, in this room, because I believe investors deserve the truth more than they deserve a comfortable morning." The second slide. A transaction summary. 47 wire transfers. Dates, amounts, entity names, $1,470,000, laid out in a format so clear it required no interpretation. The room was completely silent now. "These transfers," I said, "were made without my knowledge or authorization from Meridian IP Holdings, a subsidiary I co-own, to a series of shell companies with no legitimate business operations. The money funded a parallel private life maintained by a member of this company's executive leadership. The full audit is available to any investor who requests it, in physical form, certified by Dr. Susan Park's team, and independently verified by our legal counsel." Third slide. The corporate structure of Vela Consulting, Western Bright Solutions. The Whitmore Family Holdings real estate connection. Clean, documented, undeniable. "The individual responsible for these transfers," I said, "also arranged, during a period when I was caring for my dying father, to fraudulently dissolve my marriage, using a forged signature and a complicit notary, in order to reclassify my inheritance as separate property and protect himself from legal exposure." I paused. "That individual is currently seated in this room." I did not look at Damien when I said it. I looked at the investors. The sound that went through the room was not dramatic. It wasn't a gasp exactly. It was more like the collective intake of breath that happens when 400 people simultaneously understand that the ground they're standing on is different from what they thought. In the press section, I could see 3 journalists already typing. "I am telling you this," I said, "not because it benefits me to tell it. It does not, in the short term, benefit me in any way to stand in front of this room and say these words. I'm telling you because I built this company on the principle that the people who trust you with their resources deserve the truth. And I will not stand at a podium in a company with my name on the door and ask you to invest on the basis of a false picture." I took a breath. "What I can tell you is this. The fraud has been referred to the King County prosecutor and to the SEC's Civil Enforcement Division. The relevant accounts have been frozen. The forensic documentation has been preserved and is in the custody of independent legal counsel. And the technical infrastructure of this company, which you may have heard was subject to potential disruption this morning, is fully secured and operational, as the past 90 minutes of this presentation have demonstrated. I saw it on Damien's face then, the moment it assembled. Not just the evidence presentation, not just the frozen accounts, but the last piece. As the past 90 minutes of this presentation have demonstrated, the slow-motion comprehension of a man understanding that the weapon he deployed 40 minutes ago had never worked at all. His face went through several things in quick succession. I watched it from the podium because I was looking directly at him now, and I wanted to see it. Not for satisfaction, or not only for satisfaction, and I'll be honest about that, but because after 7 weeks of moving in the dark toward something I couldn't fully see, I needed to watch it land. He stood up from his chair. "Eleanor," he said. "Sit down, Damien," I said. And the room, 400 people, held its breath. He didn't sit down. He took 2 steps toward the stage, and something in his face had broken through the controlled surface now. Not rage, but something more dangerous than rage. The specific expression of a man who has run out of moves and knows it and hasn't yet accepted it. "You don't have anything," he said, and his voice was low and tight. "You have accounting documents that can be interpreted 6 different ways and a notary who gave a statement under pressure. That's not a case." "We also have your voice," I said. He stopped. I looked at him. "You told me in my own office with a recorder running that the subsidiary transfers were your doing, that the divorce was Vanessa's execution of a plan you were aware of, and that you had the intention of disrupting this presentation if I moved against you legally." I paused. "Washington is a 2-party consent state. I told you I was recording. You continued talking anyway." Something left his face. I can't describe it better than that. Something that had been holding his expression together simply left, and what remained was older and more tired than I had seen him look in 30 years. "There are also," I said, more quietly now, "federal agents in the corridor outside this room. They've been waiting for my signal. I'm going to ask you to sit down, and I'm going to ask the security personnel at the back of the room to ensure that the exits remain accessible in an orderly fashion." I looked at Roy, who was standing near the back wall. Roy sent the text. What happened next was not clean. I want to be precise about that, because I've told this story enough times in the months since that I've felt the pull toward the version where everything goes smoothly, where the agents enter, Damien accepts the situation with dignity, the room reorganizes itself, and the presentation continues. That version is tidier. It's also false. What actually happened was that Damien moved toward the side exit, fast, in the specific way of someone who still believes there's a door they can reach. 2 of the event's security personnel cut him off, not roughly, but effectively. And there was a brief, ugly moment where he argued with them in a low, pressured voice, while the federal agents came through the main doors and the 400 people in that room watched a man's career and freedom end in real time. I stood at the podium and did not move. One of the agents, a woman, younger than I expected, with the careful, professional manner of someone who had done this enough times to know that spectacle doesn't help anyone, approached Damien and spoke to him quietly. He stopped arguing. His shoulders changed. He looked once more at the room, at the investors, at the screen still showing the forensic accounting data, at me. And then he looked away and walked with the agents toward the exit. The door closed behind them. The room was quiet for a full 5 seconds. Then Arthur Wynne, who had been sitting in the front row with the composed stillness of a man who had been briefed but was still finding the reality of the moment different from the preparation, stood up and turned to face the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want to thank Eleanor Whitmore for her transparency and her courage in bringing this information to this room directly. On behalf of the board, I want to assure all of you that the governance failures that enabled this situation have been identified, addressed, and will not be repeated. And I want to invite you to remain, because the investment case for Whitmore Systems has not changed. And the woman who just stood at that podium and told you the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent is the reason for that." I don't know what I expected from the room at that moment. I had not been able to model it in all my preparation because the human element of 400 people processing a simultaneous shock is not something you can map in advance. What happened was that several people started clapping. Not a wave. It wasn't that cinematic. It was uneven and a little tentative at first. the way applause sounds when people aren't sure if it's appropriate, and then it spread, and then it was most of the room. I stood at the podium and received it, and I was not, I'll tell you honestly, in any condition to be gracious about it. I was shaking slightly in the way that happens after adrenaline has finished its job, and the body is figuring out what to do with itself, and my eyes were doing something I was not giving them permission to do. I looked at Faye, who was at the side of the room. She was not clapping. She was just looking at me with an expression that contained 30 years of shared history, and she nodded once in that sharp, decisive way she had. I turned back to the room. "Thank you," I said. "Let's continue." The presentation ran another 2 hours. I don't want to make that sound easy, because it wasn't. Presenting financial growth projections and product roadmap details to a room of institutional investors 2 hours after your husband has been arrested in front of them requires a particular kind of compartmentalization that I am not sure I could have managed at any other point in my life. At 68, with 35 years of learning to put the personal crisis in a box while the professional necessity runs its course, I could do it, but only barely. Dr. Susan Park handled the financial section. Our chief technology officer, a young man named Patrick Rourke, who had joined the company 4 years earlier and knew the systems second only to Damien, handled the technical overview and directly addressed the security architecture, explaining to the room that the company's infrastructure had been independently audited and hardened in the preceding weeks. One of the institutional investors, a woman from a large Pacific Northwest investment fund, raised her hand during the Q&A. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "I want to ask a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." "I wouldn't have it any other way," I said. "The individual who just left this room was your chief engineer for 27 years. The technical infrastructure of this company was substantially his work. How confident are you, concretely, not rhetorically, that you understand what he built and can sustain it without him?" It was the right question. It was the question I would have asked in her position. "Patrick Rourke has been Damien's number 2 for 4 years," I said. "He knows the system. Our cybersecurity team, which has been inside our architecture for 3 weeks, has documented every component. We've also identified, but I'm going to be transparent about this, a number of proprietary backdoors that were not disclosed to the board or to me, which Carla Hines' team has neutralized. The audit of those backdoors is included in the technical appendix of the documentation your fund will receive this afternoon." I paused. "The short answer to your question is yes, I am confident. But I wouldn't ask you to take my word for that. I'd ask you to read the technical audit and make your own judgment." She wrote something in her notebook and nodded. The session ended at noon. Margaret found me in a small anteroom off the main corridor, where I had gone to sit down for 5 minutes and do nothing, which I had not done in 7 weeks. She came in and closed the door and sat across from me in one of the chairs and didn't say anything for a moment. "Damien is in custody," she said finally. "Processing will take most of the afternoon. His attorney arrived at the precinct before we did, which is typical." I nodded. "Vanessa Cole was picked up at the Mercer Island house at 9:45 this morning, simultaneous with the presentation. She didn't resist. Marcus Cole was taken into custody at his business address in Tacoma. And the child? Child Services has been involved since last night. He's with a neighbor family that Vanessa had designated as emergency contacts. He's safe." I sat with that. A 5-year-old boy who called Damien Dad, who was nobody's biological son in the way anyone had assumed, who was now at the center of a custody and welfare situation that was going to be long and complicated, and not my responsibility to solve. I felt something about that which I couldn't fully name. Not guilt, not responsibility. Something more like sorrow for a child who had not chosen any of the circumstances of his life, who was a casualty of other people's choices in the way that children always are. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "That's not something I can answer." I nodded. I appreciated the honesty. "The fund," I said. "Where does it stand?" Margaret allowed herself something that was almost a smile. 3 of the institutional representatives spoke to Arthur Wynne before they left. Preliminary indication is that 2 of the 3 are still committed at their original amounts. The third wants 48 hours. The Pacific Northwest Fund, she paused for effect, which was unlike her, increased their commitment by 15%. I stared at her. "The woman who asked you the direct question," Margaret said, "she called Arthur during the lunch break. She said," and I'm quoting Arthur, quoting her, "I've been in this business for 25 years, and I have never once seen a founder stand up in front of 400 investors and tell the truth when lying would have been easier. That's the founder I want to back." I was quiet for a moment. I thought about the woman I had been at 40, pitching to skeptical loan officers. I thought about every room I'd ever walked into where the assumption was that I'd be the one to fold first. I thought about Damien at a dinner party 20 years ago. Eleanor is the face of the company. I'm the engine. I thought about how I had laughed at that. "How did the recording hold up?" I asked. "Perfectly. Every word. His legal team will challenge it. That's what legal teams do. But it was properly disclosed, the quality is clear, and the content is unambiguous. Combined with the financial documentation and the notary's statement, the prosecutor's office described it as," she paused, choosing the word, "unusually comprehensive." "Roy's word was thorough," I said. "Roy is an understatement man," Margaret said. For the first time in 7 weeks, I laughed. It was brief and a little ragged, not the kind of laugh that signals things are fine, but the kind that signals that you are still alive and that sometimes that has to be enough. The formal charges were filed the following morning. Damien faced 6 counts, including corporate fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit identity fraud, and obstruction. The attempted server room deletion had been documented and added to the package. Vanessa Cole faced 4 counts, including identity fraud for her role in the forged dissolution filing, conspiracy, and fraud as a beneficiary of the shell company network. Marcus Cole faced 2 counts relating to the receipt of fraudulent payments. Calvin Breer, the notary, had already negotiated a cooperation agreement and would likely face reduced charges in exchange for his testimony. Preston Cole, Vanessa's second cousin, the board member who had sat inside our governance structure for 6 years, was not criminally charged because the evidence of his direct involvement in the fraud was circumstantial. But the undisclosed conflict of interest was sufficient for a civil suit, and Margaret was already building it. I sat in Margaret's office the morning the charges were filed and read through the documentation carefully, the way I always read through anything important, not skimming, not summarizing, word by word. When I finished, I set the papers down. "The divorce decree," I said. "The fraudulent dissolution. Already in process. The court will void it on the basis of fraud upon the court. The fraudulent filing will be expunged from the record." Margaret looked at me. "You were never legally divorced, Eleanor. The court will confirm that formally within 30 to 60 days. I thought about the plain white envelope in the foyer, the weight of it in my hand, the words "final decree of dissolution," and the particular quality of the silence that followed. I had been married for 31 years to a man who tried to erase that marriage while I was grieving my father, so he could protect himself from the consequences of stealing my money. And the law was going to say, it never happened. He was never legally free of the marriage he'd tried to quietly bury. Every protection he'd been trying to build around himself by engineering that divorce, every legal wall between my inheritance and his liability, had already crumbled when the fraud was exposed. "And the assets?" I asked. "The Mercer Island property, the funds remaining in the shell company accounts. Subject to civil recovery proceedings, the property will be seized. The remaining funds in the Cole accounts are frozen pending litigation. You won't recover everything. Some of it is gone, spent on vehicles and living expenses over 2 years. But we expect to recover the substantial majority." I nodded. "One more thing," Margaret said. She opened a folder on her desk. "The DNA results. Damien's attorneys were served with them this morning as part of the discovery package." I had been waiting for this. I had been carrying this piece of information for weeks, knowing it would surface through the legal process, and knowing that when it did, it would land on Damien the way the original fraud charges had landed on me, as a structure collapsing all at once that he hadn't known was unsound. "How did he respond?" I asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He didn't, initially. His attorney accepted the service and said nothing, but she paused. About an hour later, Damien requested to speak with his attorney privately. The session lasted 2 hours. When it ended, his attorney withdrew 3 of the 6 points in their planned defense strategy. I absorbed that. A man who had sacrificed a 31-year marriage, had stolen over $1 million from the company his wife built, had fraudulently erased that marriage on paper, had threatened to destroy the business rather than face consequences, and had justified all of it, I believed, at least partly, with the conviction that he was building something real. A family. A son. A life that was more than what he'd had. And the son wasn't his. Vanessa had built her own architecture inside his. She had taken his protection, his money, his belief, and constructed a version of reality that served her, independent of what was true. He had done it to me. She had done it to him. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest, because I've had people ask me in the months since whether I felt vindicated by that particular revelation, whether there was something like justice in Damien being deceived in the same way he had deceived me. What I actually felt was tired, a profound structural tiredness that went deeper than sleep deprivation. The tiredness of understanding fully that the person I had shared my life with for 31 years was capable of things I could not have imagined, and that the woman I had loved like a daughter was capable of things that made his betrayal look almost simple by comparison. There was no satisfaction in that. There was only the weight of it, which I was going to have to carry for a long time. But I had carried heavier things. I stood up from Margaret's conference room table and picked up my bag. "What's next?" she asked. "I have a board meeting at 2 o'clock, I said, "and then I have a company to run." She stood as well, and we looked at each other for a moment across the conference room table. 2 women who had spent 7 weeks in the trenches of something neither of us would forget, and who had, between us, built something that would hold. "Eleanor," she said, "for what it's worth, I've done this for 20 years, and I have never seen anyone handle what you handled the way you handled it." I thought about all the ways I had not handled it perfectly. The nights I'd lain awake going over every decision, the moments when the anger had gotten inside the calculation and I'd had to wrestle it back out. The evening I'd sat in the driveway of the house and come closer to breaking than I'd admitted to anyone. I handled it the only way I knew how, I said, which was true, and which was, I thought, enough. I walked out of Margaret Chen's office into the November afternoon, and Seattle was doing something unusual. The sky had cleared again, that rare deep blue, and the light off the water was sharp and cold and absolutely indifferent to everything that had just happened, the way the world always is, the way it should be. The company was still standing. I was still standing. That would have to be the beginning of something. The board meeting that afternoon ran 3 hours. I sat at the head of the conference table in the Whitmore Systems building for the first time in 7 weeks, and I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. The way the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows, the small chip in the corner of the table that had been there for years without anyone fixing it, the particular smell of the room that was coffee and dry erase markers, and the specific atmosphere of a space where decisions had been made for a long time. I had spent thousands of hours in this room. I had fought for things in this room, and lost things, and won things, and cried once, alone, after a meeting in 2009 when we came within 6 weeks of not making payroll. The room felt different now, not smaller. If anything, it felt more real than it had in years, the way things become more real when you've come close to losing them. Arthur Wynn opened the meeting. Constance Abara was present. The third board seat, Preston Cole's seat, was visibly empty, and nobody mentioned it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. First order of business, Arthur said, is a formal resolution confirming Eleanor Whitmore's authority as sole executive officer of Whitmore Systems, pending the restructuring of leadership following recent events. Asio. He looked around the table. All in favor? It was unanimous. The second order of business was Patrick Rourke's appointment as interim chief technology officer. Patrick was 39 years old, had joined us out of a mid-sized enterprise software firm in Austin, and had spent 4 years understanding the company's systems with a thoroughness that I had always respected but never fully appreciated until Carla Hines told me, during the infrastructure audit, that Patrick had independently documented several of the backdoors Damien had built, documented them, and flagged them in internal memos that had, apparently, been quietly archived without response. I looked at him across the conference table. "Those memos," I said, "you filed them 2 years ago." He met my eyes steadily. "Yes." "They were archived without action." "Yes." "Did you know why?" A pause. "I suspected," he said carefully. "I didn't have evidence. I didn't know what I was actually looking at. I thought it might be legacy code with security implications, not something intentional, but something about it bothered me enough to document it." I held his gaze for a moment. "It bothered you enough to document it, and you said nothing more loudly." "No," he said. And he didn't dress that up or apologize excessively for it. He just said it plainly, which I respected more than any amount of explanation would have been. "That's a mistake," I said. "Not an unforgivable one, but a mistake." "I know," he said. "Don't make it again." "No, ma'am." The third order of business was harder. It was the question of the company's public communication, what we said, to whom, and when. The investor presentation had already been witnessed by 400 people, which meant the story was already in motion. 3 journalists had filed pieces by noon. By the time the board meeting started, the story was on 2 regional business outlets and 1 national technology publication. Margaret's communications team had prepared a formal statement, which I reviewed and approved with 2 modifications. I removed a phrase that characterized Damien's actions as isolated, because they were not isolated. They were systematic. And I removed a line that expressed hope for a swift resolution to the legal proceedings, because I had learned over the course of this year that the word swift in legal context is almost always a lie you tell yourself. What remained was honest. It described the fraud, confirmed the criminal referrals, and committed the company to full cooperation with investigators. It also, in its final paragraph, named the investment round as proceeding, which was the piece of information that mattered most to the people reading it with a financial stake. By the time the board meeting ended at 5:30, I had been awake for 34 hours. Faye walked me to the elevator and handed me my bag and told me to go to the hotel and sleep, in exactly the tone she had used for 22 years when she thought I was pushing myself past a sensible limit. "I'll be in at 8 tomorrow," I said. "You'll be in at 9, she said. "I'm locking the building until 9. "Faye?" "Eleanor." She looked at me. "You won today. You can sleep." I stood in the elevator and held that sentence for the length of the ride down. You won today. I didn't feel like I'd won anything, exactly. I felt like someone who had survived something and was still in the middle of understanding what surviving it meant. But I was too tired to argue with Faye, which may have been her strategy all along. Toolkit. The trial, or rather the series of legal proceedings, because Damien, Vanessa, and Marcus Cole were handled in separate tracks, took the better part of 8 months. I'm not going to recount every hearing, every motion, every deposition. 8 months of legal proceedings are not a story. They're a process, and processes have their own grinding rhythm that is nothing like drama and everything like endurance. But there are moments from those 8 months that I carry with me that changed the shape of things in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The first was Damien's guilty plea. It came 3 months into the proceedings, at a point when his defense team had reviewed the full evidence package, the financial documentation, the recording from our office meeting, the notary's statement, the cybersecurity audit that documented the attempted server room deletion, and apparently concluded that a trial would accomplish nothing except an uglier and more public version of the same outcome. His attorney called Margaret's office on a Tuesday and offered a plea. Damien pled guilty to 3 counts: corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit identity fraud. The identity theft charge, which had been the one his attorneys fought hardest on, arguing that his knowledge of the forged divorce was indirect rather than directive, was ultimately included at the prosecutor's insistence based on the office recording. The sentencing recommendation was 5 to 7 years. I was not in the courtroom when he pled. Margaret had asked me whether I wanted to be there, and I had thought about it for a day, which was longer than I needed. I decided no, not because I was afraid of seeing him, and not because I thought my presence would be wrong, But because I had already sat across from Damian Whitmore in my own office and heard him tell me everything in his own words, and that moment was the one I was going to carry. Not a courtroom, not a formal proceeding. The moment when it was just the two of us, and 31 years of shared history, and the truth finally occupying the same room. I didn't need another version of that. What I did do, at the prosecutor's invitation, was submit a victim impact statement. I wrote it myself over 3 evenings, and I revised it 4 times, and the final version was shorter than the first draft by half, because everything I cut was things I had needed to say for myself, but that didn't need to be in a legal document. The statement I submitted described in plain language the financial and personal impact of what had been done to me, the 7 weeks of investigation, the legal costs, the disruption to the company, the specific harm of having my signature forged on a dissolution document during my father's final weeks. I did not write about grief. I did not write about the maple tree or the yellow legal pad or the 31 years. Those things were mine, and I was keeping them. The judge sentenced Damian to 6 years, with eligibility for parole review after 4. His attorney called the sentence harsh. Margaret called it appropriate. I called it a number on a page and tried to feel something about it, and mostly felt the same exhaustion I had been carrying for months. Vanessa's case took longer. She fought the charges, which surprised me initially, and then, on reflection, didn't. Vanessa Cole had survived on resourcefulness her entire life, and fighting was the thing she did when the situation looked terminal. She cycled through 2 attorneys. She tried, in pretrial motions, to have the notary's statement excluded on procedural grounds. She tried to characterize her role in the forged dissolution as peripheral. She had procured the notarization, yes, but she claimed she had not understood what the underlying document was. The recording from my office destroyed that argument. In it, Damian's reference to the divorce being handled by Vanessa, combined with the specific operational details that only direct involvement could explain, made the peripheral characterization unsustainable. She pled guilty in month 6. 2 counts: identity fraud and conspiracy. The sentencing recommendation was 3 to 5 years. I was in the courtroom for her sentencing. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't for satisfaction, or not primarily. It was because Vanessa Cole had been someone I loved, in the complicated way you love someone who isn't family, but who you've invested in as though they were. And I needed to see her face one more time in a context where neither of us was performing anything. She looked smaller in the courtroom than I remembered her. Not physically. She was the same height, the same posture, but there was something that had gone out of her, some energy that had always been in her in the years when I knew her, that restless forward momentum of a person who was always moving towards something. She sat at the defense table, and she was very still. When the judge finished, Vanessa turned her head slightly, and for a moment she was looking directly at me. I held her gaze. What I was looking for, what I found, or thought I found, was something I hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. Not defiance, not the calculation I had come to associate with her after everything I'd learned. Something that looked for a few unguarded seconds like recognition. Like a woman who had made a very large and irreversible decision about her life, and was only now, in this courtroom, fully understanding what it had cost. The judge sentenced her to 4 years. She was let out. She didn't look at me again. I sat in the courtroom for a few minutes after it emptied, in the way you sit after something you've been moving toward for a long time has finally arrived, and you need a moment to understand that it's real. Margaret sat beside me and said nothing, which was the right thing. "What happens to the boy?" I asked. "Vanessa's mother has filed for emergency guardianship," Margaret said. "The biological father, whoever he is, hasn't been identified through the legal proceedings. The child welfare case is separate from the criminal case." "Is her mother in a position to provide for him?" "She lives in Spokane. Works as a medical billing coordinator. She appears stable." A pause. "Eleanor, I want to gently note that his welfare is not your legal responsibility." "I know that," I said. "I say it because I've seen you carry things that aren't yours to carry." I looked at her. "I'm not going to do anything. I just wanted to know." She nodded carefully in the way of someone who wasn't entirely convinced but was going to accept the answer. The truth was more complicated than that, and I think she knew it. The truth was that I thought about that little boy more than was useful or rational. A child who had been the center of a catastrophe he had no part in creating, who was growing up knowing his mother was in prison and that the man he'd called dad was also in prison, and that the reasons for both of those things were beyond any child's comprehension. I thought about him the way I thought about a lot of things in those months, with a sadness that had no clean resolution, that I had to simply learn to put down and walk away from, and that I didn't always manage to put down on the first try. Marcus Cole received 18 months and a substantial civil judgment requiring repayment of the fraudulent payments, which his attorney negotiated down from the original restitution demand over 2 months of back and forth. Calvin Breer, the notary, received a suspended sentence and 5 years probation in exchange for his full cooperation, and lost his notary commission permanently. Preston Cole settled the civil conflict of interest suit for an amount that Margaret described as meaningful without being what he deserved, which I took to mean it covered a substantial portion of our legal costs without fully accounting for 6 years of compromised governance. By the time all proceedings were closed, we had recovered $1.1 million of the $1.47 million in stolen funds. The remainder had been spent on the Mercer Island house and the vehicles and 2 years of a life that no longer existed. The property itself was seized and sold, and those proceeds went into the recovery pool. After legal fees and the costs of the forensic team and Carla Hines' cybersecurity work, the net recovery was just under $800,000. Not everything, but most of it, and the company was intact. So, rebuilding Whitmore Systems after that year was not the triumphant narrative that people sometimes want it to be when I tell the story. It was slow and unglamorous and full of the kind of work that doesn't make for good storytelling. Restructuring the financial controls so that no single person could ever again have unilateral access to subsidiary transactions. Rebuilding the board with 3 new independent directors who had no personal connections to anyone in the company's history. Working with Patrick Rourke to document and legitimize every piece of the technical infrastructure. And having a very long and uncomfortable set of conversations with our 437 employees about what had happened and why and what we were doing about it. The employee conversations were the hardest. I stood in the company's main space 3 weeks after the investor presentation, and I talked to everyone for 45 minutes, and then I answered questions for another hour. And the questions were the kind that cut because they were honest, and because the people asking them had a right to honest answers. Did you know? No. How is that possible? It's possible because I trusted the wrong person with operational authority that I should have overseen more closely. Is the company safe now? I believe so. I cannot promise you certainty. I can only tell you what we've done and let you judge. Are you going to be all right? That last question came from a young woman in the back row, a junior developer who had been with the company for 14 months and who asked it with a directness that reminded me of myself at her age. The room got a little quieter when she asked it, in the way rooms get quiet when someone says the thing everyone is thinking but nobody wanted to be the first to say. I don't know yet, I said. I'm working on it. It was the most honest answer I'd given all day, and I think it landed better than a confident reassurance would have. The investment round closed 2 months after the presentation. The final commitment was $58 million against our original target of $60 million. 2 of the smaller investors had pulled back after the fraud disclosure, which I had anticipated and which was, honestly, the right decision for them. What we got was still the largest single capital event in the company's history, and what we got it with was a room that had watched me stand at a podium and tell the truth when lying would have been significantly easier. The Pacific Northwest Fund's representative, the woman who had asked me the direct question about technical continuity, became a board observer. Her name was Diana Sue, and she was one of the sharpest people I had met in years, which was saying something given the company I'd been keeping. We had lunch twice in the months after the round closed, and in our second lunch she said something that I've thought about many times since. You know what I keep coming back to? She said, over salmon and a view of the water. The 7 weeks. You found out in October and the presentation was in November. 7 weeks, and you built the entire case, secured the infrastructure, briefed the board, retained the legal team, and didn't tip him off until you were ready. Do you understand how unusual that is? I was operating under a deadline, but I said, the presentation was already scheduled. I didn't have the luxury of moving slowly.
That's not what I mean. She looked at me. Most people, when they find out someone they love has betrayed them, blow everything up within the first 72 hours. They can't help it. The pain is too loud. You didn't do that. I thought about sitting in the car in the driveway on the night I found the divorce decree. The cold clarity of understanding that anger was the most dangerous thing I could show. I've had a lot of practice, I said. Not doing the thing that feels right when the thing that feels right is also the thing that gets me killed. She laughed at that, which was the right response. I think you should teach that, she said. Seriously, not a corporate workshop, something for women who are actually in the middle of what you were in the middle of. I filed that away and didn't say anything to her about it yet, because the idea was already forming in a way that felt more substantial than an offhand lunch comment, and I wasn't ready to talk about it as though it were casual.
My father's estate transferred cleanly 4 months after the fraud was exposed. The fraudulent divorce had been formally voided by the court in month 2 of the proceedings, which meant my legal status at the time of my father's death was exactly what it should have been. A married woman with all the attendant protections and complications, and none of the manufactured vulnerabilities that Damien had been trying to engineer. Gerald Fossey processed the final transfer with the careful thoroughness he applied to everything, and when it was done, he called me and said in his quiet way that he was glad it had worked out. "You did the right thing," I told him, flagging the discrepancy. "You could have processed the estate transfer and let the divorce stand as someone else's problem." "I've been doing estate work for 40 years, he said. "I've seen what happens when people let those things pass. It didn't sit right." "It saved me a great deal," I said. "It gave you the chance to save yourself," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." He was right, and I appreciated that he said it that way. What I did with part of the inheritance, not the whole thing, not even most of it, but a deliberate and considered portion, I had been thinking about since the conversation with Diana Shu at lunch, and since an afternoon 3 months before that, when Margaret Chen had said, almost offhandedly, "You know, the forensic work and the legal access we had, most women in your situation don't have any of that. Most women in your situation don't even know it's possible." I created the Merit Foundation, named after my father. Not after me. That felt like the wrong instinct, and I had been wrong about enough things in my life to be cautious about my instincts. Named after the man who had spent 60 years quietly building something in private and left it to his daughter at exactly the moment she needed it most, perhaps because he had always understood, in the way of careful and observant men, that the world sometimes required a woman to be able to fight, and that fighting required resources. The Merit Foundation's mandate was specific, not broad legal aid. There were already organizations doing that, and they were doing it well. And the last thing the nonprofit landscape needed was another generalist foundation duplicating existing work. The Merit Foundation focused on 3 things: forensic legal services for women over 60 who were experiencing financial exploitation or marital fraud, emergency financial protection counseling for women navigating probate and inheritance in the context of family conflict, and a documentation program that helped older women create and maintain legal records of their assets independent of any spouse or partner. It was, in other words, exactly the set of resources I had been lucky enough to be able to access through my own means, made available to women who didn't have those means. I had learned, in the hardest possible way, that knowledge was the difference between being erased and surviving. Gerald Fossey's careful eye on a discrepancy, Patricia's voice on the phone at 9 o'clock, Margaret's precision, Roy's understatement and his thorough file, Carla's work in the infrastructure. The fact that I had spent 35 years building relationships with competent people who answered when I called. Most women don't have that. Most women who are where I was, 68 years old, grieving, distracted, trusting, don't have a forensic accountant's number saved in their contacts. Most women don't know that a notarized signature can be subpoenaed, or that a shell company's financial structure can be audited in 7 weeks, or that Washington is a 2-party consent state and what that means for a recorded conversation. They just find the white envelope and fall apart alone. The foundation launched quietly in the spring with a staff of 3 and an advisory board that included Margaret Chen, Diana Shu, Patricia in Portland, and Constance Abra. Roy Adkins signed on as an investigative consultant. Carla Hines agreed to develop a digital security curriculum for the Foundation's clients. In the first 8 months of operation, the Merit Foundation assisted 41 women. I won't tell their stories, those aren't mine to tell. But I will tell you that the first client the Foundation served was a 72-year-old woman in Tacoma who had discovered, while settling her late mother's estate, that her son had transferred her home into his name through a power of attorney she had signed during a hospital stay 3 years earlier. She called the Foundation's intake line on a Wednesday afternoon, and by the following Tuesday she had a forensic attorney and a plan. When Margaret told me about her, I thought about the hotel room in October, the anonymous bedspread, the phone call to Patricia at 9 o'clock, the fact that Patricia had answered. I had been lucky in the middle of catastrophe, lucky that I had resources and relationships and 35 years of knowing how to navigate systems that most people find opaque. This woman in Tacoma had not been lucky. She had been alone and frightened and completely without a map. Now she had a map. That felt, more than the investment round closing or the guilty pleas or the voided divorce decree, like something I had actually built. The last thing I want to tell you about is a conversation I had with Faye 8 months after the investor presentation on an afternoon in July when the Seattle weather was doing that brief, improbable thing it does in summer where it becomes genuinely beautiful. We were in my office, late in the day, going over the calendar for the following quarter. It was the kind of meeting we had been having for 22 years, and it felt normal in the specific way that things feel normal when you've fought hard to get back to them. A little more precious than before. A little more deliberate. We were almost finished when Faye set down her notebook and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one she wore when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Have I ever been able to stop you?" "No," she agreed. "Are you happy?" "Not the company. Not the Foundation. You. Are you happy?" I looked at her. Faye had known me longer than almost anyone alive. She had watched me go through the near bankruptcy and the fertility grief and the years when the company was everything and the years when the company was not enough. And now this, the worst year of my professional and personal life, which had somehow also become one of the most clarifying. "I'm not unhappy," I said, which was true and honest and not quite the full answer. She waited. "I'm rebuilding," I said. "There are days when I feel like myself. There are days when I walk past the guest room at the house and I think about the fact that I am 68 years old and I am technically still married to a man who is currently in a federal correctional facility, and I feel the weight of that in a way that isn't something I can think my way out of." I paused. "And there are days when I stand at my office window and look at the water and I think about my father and about what he left me and about what I've done with it, and I feel something that is close enough to peace that I can call it that." Faye was quiet for a moment. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I think he'd be relieved," I said. "My father was a practical man. I think the thing that would matter most to him is that I didn't let them take what he left me." "They didn't." "No, I said. "They didn't." We sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a shared understanding that doesn't need more words, and then Faye picked up her notebook and we finished going over the calendar, because that's what you do. You finish the work, and you show up tomorrow, and you keep building. There is something I want to say directly to you before this story ends. Not as Eleanor Whitmore, not as a character in a narrative, but as someone who has lived inside this kind of betrayal and come out the other side knowing things I didn't know before. What happened to me is not a story about an unusually cruel man or an unusually treacherous woman. It is a story about the specific vulnerability that comes from loving people more than you verify them, from extending trust because trust feels like love, and love is the thing you've built your life around. From assuming that the people who have benefited from your generosity are grateful rather than calculating, and from believing that the people who share your daily life cannot simultaneously be dismantling it. I made those assumptions for 31 years, and I am not going to spend whatever time I have left telling myself I was foolish for making them. I was not foolish. I was human. The desire to trust the people you love is not a character flaw. It is one of the few truly decent impulses we have. What I was, and I want to be precise about this, was insufficiently protected, not emotionally, legally, financially, in the structures that surround a life and that most of us ignore because setting them up requires imagining a future in which the people we love have become our adversaries. I'm telling you, set them up anyway. If you are in a marriage or a partnership, know what you own, know what you have signed, know what your partner has access to, and on what terms. Review your financial structure not because you expect betrayal, but because a woman who knows what she owns cannot be quietly erased by a forged document in a hospice corridor. A woman who has independent legal counsel and independent financial records is a woman who cannot be disappeared without her knowledge. These are not romantic ideas. I understand that. The conversation you need to have with a financial advisor when you are 60 and your father is dying is not the conversation you want to be having. The document review that would have caught Damien's subsidiary manipulation years earlier is not the thing you think about when you're proud of what you've built together. I know all of that. I lived it. But I also know what it feels like to stand in a foyer with a white envelope in your hand and understand that someone has been building against you while you were building for both of you. And I know what it costs. Not just financially, but in the specific currency of a life, in years and trust, and the particular grief of loving someone who turned out to be a long, careful performance. Don't let that be you. And if it is already you, if you are reading this from inside that hotel room or that foyer or that probate attorney's office where the document doesn't say what you thought your life said, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not finished. The envelope is not the end of your story. It is the first page of the chapter where you stop being the person things happen to and start being the person who decides what happens next. That chapter is hard. I will not lie to you and tell you it isn't. 7 weeks of investigation and 8 months of legal proceedings and the grinding labor of rebuilding a company and a self at 68 years old, none of that was easy, and none of it was clean, and there were nights in that hotel room when I lay on top of the covers and wondered whether the version of me who never found the envelope might have been, in some purely comfortable sense, happier. But that version of me would have spent the rest of her life in a marriage that had already ended, in a company that was being quietly gutted, with a fortune her father had built being absorbed into a fraud she didn't know was happening. That version of me would have been comfortable and obliterated simultaneously. I chose the envelope, and I want you to know, whatever envelope is sitting in your foyer right now, whatever document or conversation or phone call or discovery is waiting to change the shape of everything you thought your life was, you can choose it too. You can choose to know. You can choose to be the person who sees clearly rather than the person who sees comfortably. That choice is terrifying. I will not minimize the terror of it. But terror is survivable. Silence is not. It is spring now. I know this because the maple tree in the front yard of the house I've lived in for 31 years is doing what it does in April, putting out those particular small leaves that are more red than green at first, before they settle into summer. I stand at the living room window sometimes in the morning with my coffee, and I look at that tree and I think about the man who planted it, who is now in a federal correctional facility in eastern Washington. And I think about the 31 years that the tree has been growing while we were doing all the things we were doing inside the house. The house is mine. All of it, legally, unambiguously mine. The divorce was voided, the marriage was never dissolved, and the civil proceedings awarded me sole title to the marital property as part of the fraud settlement. I did not have to leave. I chose to stay, which is different, and the difference matters to me. I had some people suggest, after everything, that I should sell it, start fresh somewhere, that the house contained too much history to be livable. I understood the logic. I didn't agree with it. This is my house. I have been in every room of it for 31 years. I bought the paint colors and chose the floors and planted the garden and built the life that happened here. And no one is going to make me feel like a guest in something I built. I kept the tree. I had someone remove the guest room furniture and turn that room into an office for the foundation's administrative work. A small, practical way of making the space say something different than it had before. Faye laughed at that when I told her. "Very you," she said. "I know," I said. "I've made my peace with that. At 68 years old, I run a technology company that has just completed the most successful capital raise in its history.
I chair a foundation that has helped 41 women in its first 8 months and is expanding its intake capacity. I have a board I trust and a CTO who documents things and a cybersecurity specialist on retainer because I have learned in the most direct possible way that technical infrastructure is not a department you delegate and forget. I have Margaret Chen's number in my phone and Roy Adkins' number in my phone and Patricia in Portland who still answers on the second ring. I am still married technically to a man who will be eligible for parole in 3 years. The divorce, the real one, initiated by me, through my own attorney, on my own terms, not forged in a hospice corridor, is proceeding through the courts with the particular slowness of all legal things. It will be final by the end of the year. When it is, I will be a single woman for the first time since 1994, and I have decided to find that interesting rather than devastating. I am not the same person who stood in that foyer in October. I don't think I'm a better person, necessarily. I'm not sure that's the right frame. I'm a more accurate person. I see more clearly. I trust more carefully. I love, I think, with a little more precision than I did before, a little less of the unconditional, wide-open generosity that made me vulnerable, and a little more of the grounded, clear-eyed affection that knows the difference between a person who has earned your trust and a person who has simply asked for it. That's not cynicism. I want to be clear about that. Cynicism would be closing the door. What I have is something harder and more valuable than cynicism. It's discernment, the ability to see a person as they actually are, rather than as the story about them that you've been telling yourself. It cost me a great deal to learn that. But I am standing in the morning light in the house I built, looking at the tree that has been growing for 30 years, and I am still here, and the company is still standing, and 41 women have a map they didn't have before, and my father's name is on a foundation that will outlast everything that was done to me. The day I found that envelope, the day I stood in my foyer with cemetery earth on my shoes and a divorce, I never signed in my hands, so that was not the day my life fell apart. That was the day I woke up, and I have been awake, completely, for the first time in a very long time. The window is cold under my hand. The coffee is getting warm. The maple tree is doing what it does in April, patient and enormous, and completely indifferent to everything that has happened beneath it. I take a sip of coffee. I go to work.